The Improvement of Human Reason in the Life of Hayy Ibn Yaqzan by Ibn Tufayl. Translated by Simon Ockley. Introduction to the Life of Hayy Ibn Yaqzan. In the name of the most merciful God. Blessed be the Almighty and Eternal, the infinitely wise and merciful God, who hath taught us the use of the pen, who out of his great goodness to mankind has made him understand things which he did not know. I praise him for his excellent gifts, and give him thanks for his continued benefits, and I testify that there is but one God, and that he has no partner, and that Muhammad is his servant and apostle, endued with an excellent spirit and master of convincing demonstration, and a victorious sword. The blessing of God be upon him and his companions, men of great thoughts and vast understandings, and upon all his followers, to the end of the world. You ask me, dear friend, God preserve you forever and make you partaker of everlasting happiness, to communicate to you what I knew concerning the mysteries of the Eastern philosophy, mentioned by the learned Avicenna. Now you must understand that whoever designs to attain to a clear and distinct knowledge must be diligent in the search of it. Indeed, your request gave me a noble turn of thought, and brought me to the understanding of what I never knew before. Nay, it advanced me to such an elevation as no tongue, how eloquent soever, is able to express. And the reason is, because 'tis of a quite different nature and kind from the things of this world. Only this there is in it, that whoever has attained to any degree of it is so mightily affected with joy, pleasure, and exaltation, that 'tis impossible for him to conceal his sense of it, but he is forced to utter some general expressions, since he cannot be particular. Now, if a man who has not been polished by good education happens to attain to that state, he tuns out into strange expressions, and speaks he knows not what, so that one of this sort of men, when in that state, cried out, "Praise to be me, how wonderful am I!" Another said, "I am truth." Another, that he was God. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, when he had attained to it, expressed himself thus: "'Twas what it was, 'tis not to be expressed. Inquire no further, but conceive the best." But he was a man that had good learning and was well versed in the sciences. What Avenpace says at the end of his discourse concerning the union is worth your observing. There he says that 'twill appear plainly to anyone that understands the design of his book, that that degree is not attainable by the means of those sciences which were then in use, but that he attained to what he knew by being altogether abstracted from anything which he had been acquainted with before, and that he was furnished with other notions altogether independent upon matter, and of too noble a nature to be any way attributed to the natural life, but were peculiar to the blessed, and which upon that account we may call divine proprieties, which God, whose name be praised, bestows upon such of his servants as he pleases. Now this degree which this author mentions is attainable by speculative knowledge, nor is it to be doubted but that he had reached it himself, but not that which we have just now mentioned, which notwithstanding is not so much different from it in kind as in degree. For in that which I mentioned, there are no discoveries made which contradict those which this author means, but the difference consists in this, viz., that in our way there is a greater degree of clearness and perspicuity than there is in the other. For in this we apprehend things by the help of something, which we cannot properly call a power, nor indeed will any of those words, which are either used in common discourse or occur in the writings of the learned, serve to express that by which this sort of perception does apprehend. This degree, which I have already mentioned, and which perhaps I should never have had any taste of, if your request had not put me upon a farther search, is the very same thing which Avicenna means, where he says, "Then when a man's desires are raised to a good pitch, and he is competently well exercised in that way, there will appear to him some small glimmerings of the truth, as it were flashes of lightning, very delightful, which just shine upon him and then go out. Then the more he exercises himself, the oftener he'll perceive them, till at last he'll become so well acquainted with them that they will occur to him spontaneously, without any exercise at all. And then, as soon as he perceives anything, he applies himself to the divine essence, so as to retain some impression of it. Then something occurs, to him on a sudden, whereby he begins to discern the truth in everything, till through frequent exercise he at last attains to a perfect tranquillity, and that which used to appear to him only by fits and starts becomes habitual, and that which was only a glimmering before, a constant light, and he obtains a constant and steady knowledge." Thus far Avicenna. Besides, He has given an account of those several steps and degrees by which a man is brought to this perfection, till his soul is like a polished looking-glass, in which he beholds the truth. And then he swims in pleasure and rejoices exceedingly in his mind, because of the impressions of truth which he perceives in it. When he is once attained thus far, the next thing which employs him is that he sometimes looks towards truth and sometimes towards himself, and thus he fluctuates between both, till he retires from himself wholly, and looks only toward the divine essence. And if he does at any time look towards his own soul, the only reason is because that looks towards God, and from thence arises a perfect conjunction with God. And according to this manner which he has described, he does by no means allow that this taste is attained by way of speculation or deduction of consequences. And that you may the more clearly apprehend the difference between the perception of these sort of men and those other, I shall propose you a familiar instance. Suppose a man born blind, but of quick parts, and a good capacity, a tenacious memory, and solid judgment, who had lived in the place of his nativity till he had, by the help of the rest of his senses, contracted an acquaintance with a great many in the neighbourhood, and learned the several kinds of animals, and things inanimate, and the streets and houses of the town, so as to go anywhere about it without a guide, and to know such people as he met, and call them by their names, and knew the names of colours, and the difference of them by their descriptions and definitions, and after he had learned all this, should have his eyes opened. Why, this man, when he walked about the town, would find everything to be exactly agreeable to those notions which he had before, and that colours were such as he had before conceived them to be by those descriptions he had received, so that the difference between his apprehensions when blind and those which he would have now his eyes were opened would consist only in these two great things, one of which is a consequent of the other, viz., a greater clearness and extreme delight. From whence 'tis plain that the condition of those contemplators who have not yet attained to the union with God is exactly like that of the blind man, and the notion which a blind man has of colours, by their description, answers to those things which Avonpace said were of too noble a nature to be any ways attributed to the natural life, and which God bestows upon such his servants as he pleases. But the condition of those who have attained to the union, to whom God has given that which I told you could not be properly expressed by the word power, is that second state of the blind man curd. Take notice, by the way, that our similitude is not exactly applicable in every case, for there is very seldom anyone found that is born with his eyes open that can attain to these things without any help of contemplation. Now, my dear friend, I do not here, when I speak of the ideas of the contemplative, mean what they learn from the study of physics, nor by the notions of those who have attained to the union, what they learn from the study of metaphysics, for these two ways of learning are vastly different, and must by no means be confounded. But what I mean by the ideas of the contemplative is, what is attained by the study of metaphysics, of which kind is that which Avonpace understood, and in the apprehension of these things, this condition is necessarily required, viz., that it be manifestly and clearly true. And then there is a middle sort of speculation, between that and those who have attained to the union, who employ themselves in these things with greater perspicuity and delight. Now Avonpace blames all those that make any mention of this pleasure which is enjoyed in the union, before the vulgar. Besides, he said that it belonged to the imaginative faculty, and promised to write a book about it, in which he designed to give an account of the whole matter and describe the condition of those who were so happy as to attain it clearly and perspicuously. But we may answer him with the old proverb, viz., don't say a thing is sweet before you taste on't, for he never was so good as his word, nor performed anything like it. But 'tis probable that the reason why he did not was either because he was straitened for time, being taken up with his journey to Wahran, or else because he was sensible that if he should undertake to give a description of that state, the nature of such a kind of discourse would unavoidably have put him upon a necessity of speaking some things, which would manifestly have reproached his own manner of living, and contradicted those principles which he himself had elsewhere laid down, in which he encourages men to heap up riches, and proposes several ways and means in order to the acquiring them. We have in this discourse, as necessity required, digressed something from the main design of what you desired. It appears from what has been already said, that you must either mean, 1. That I should describe to you what they see and taste, who are so happy as to enjoy the union, which is impossible to be described as it really is, and when anyone goes about to express it, either by speech or writing, he quite alters the thing and sinks into the speculative way. For when you once come to clothe it with letters and words, it comes nearer to the corporeal world, and does by no means remain in the same state that it was in before, and the significations of these words which are used in the explaining it are quite altered, so that it occasions a great many real mistakes to some, and makes others believe that they are mistaken, when indeed they are not. And the reason of this is because it is a thing of infinite extent, comprehending all things in itself, but not comprehended by any. 2. Or else the meaning of your request must be this, that I should show you after what manner they proceed, who give themselves to contemplation. And this, my good friend, is a thing which is capable of being expressed both by speech and writing, but 'tis as scarce as old gold, especially in this part of the world where we live. For 'tis so rare that there's hardly 1 of 1,000 gets so much as a smattering of it, and of those few, scarce any, have communicated anything of what they knew in that kind, but only by obscure hints and innuendos. Indeed, the Hanafitic sect and the Muslim religion do forbid men to dive too far into this matter. Nor would I have you think that the philosophy which we find in the books of Aristotle and Alpharabius, and in Avicenna's book which he calls Al-Shefa, does answer the end which you aim at, nor have any of the Spanish philosophers writ fully and satisfactorily about it. Because those scholars which were bred in Spain, before the knowledge of logic and philosophy was broached amongst them, spent their whole lives in mathematics, in which it must be allowed, they made a great progress, but went no farther. After them came a generation of men who applied themselves more to the art of reasoning, in which they excelled their predecessors, yet not so as to attain to true perfection. So that one of them said, "'Tis hard the kinds of knowledge are but two, the one erroneous, the other true. The former profits nothing when 'tis gained, and the others difficult to be attained." After these came others who still advanced further, and made nearer approaches to the truth, among whom there was one that had a sharper wit, or truer notions of things than Avenpace, but he was too much taken up with worldly business, and died before he had time to open the treasury of his knowledge, so that most of those pieces of his which are extant are imperfect, particularly his book about the soul, and his Tedbiro el-Mutawahid, i.e. how a man ought to manage himself that leads a solitary life. So are his logics and physics. Those pieces of his which are complete are only short tracts and some occasional letters. Nay, in his epistle concerning the union, he himself confesses that he had wrote nothing complete, where he says that it would require a great deal of trouble and pains to express that clearly which he had undertaken to prove, and that the method which he had made use of in explaining himself was not in many places so exact as it might have been, and that he designed, if he had time, to alter it. So much for Avenpace. I, for my part, never saw him, and as for his contemporaries, they were far inferior to him, nor did I ever see any of their works. Those who are now alive are either such as are still advancing forwards, or else such as have left off without attaining to perfection. If there are any other, I know nothing of them. As to those works of Alpharabius which are extant, they are most of them logic. There are a great many things very dubious in his philosophical works, for in his Melatolfadela, i.e. the most excellent sect, he asserts expressly that the souls of wicked men shall suffer everlasting punishment, and yet says as positively in his Politics that they shall be dissolved and annihilated, and that the souls of the perfect shall remain forever. And then in his Ethics, speaking concerning the happiness of man, he says that it is only in this life, and then adds that whatsoever people talk of besides is mere whimsy and old wives' fables. A principle which, if believed, would make all men despair of the mercy of God, and puts the good and evil both upon the same level, in that it makes annihilation the common end to them both. This is an error not to be pardoned by any means, or made amends for. Besides all this, he had a mean opinion of the gift of prophecy, and said that in his judgment it did belong to the faculty of imagination, and that he preferred philosophy before it, with a great many other things of the like nature, not necessary to be mentioned here. As for the books of Aristotle, Avicenna's exposition of them in his Al-Shefa, i.e. health, supplies their room, for he trod in the same steps and was of the same sect. In the beginning of that book says that the truth was in his opinion different from what he had there delivered, that he had written that book according to the philosophy of the Peripatetics. But those that would know the truth clearly, and without obscurity, he refers to his book of the Eastern philosophy. Now he that takes the pains to compare his Al-Shefa with what Aristotle has written will find they agree in most things, though in the Al-Shefa there are a great many things which are not extant in any of those pieces which we have of Aristotle. But if the reader take the literal sense only, either of the Al-Shefa or Aristotle, without penetrating into the hidden sense, he will never attain to perfection, as Avicenna himself observes in the Al-Shefa. As for Al-Ghazali, he often contradicts himself, denying in one place what he affirmed in another. He taxes the philosophers with heresy in his book, which he calls Al-Tahaful, i.e. destruction, because they deny the resurrection of the body, and hold that rewards and punishments in a future state belong to the soul only. Then, in the beginning of his Al-Mizan, i.e. the balance, he affirms positively that this is the doctrine of the Sufians, and that he was convinced of the truth of it, after a great deal of study and search. There are a great many such contradictions as these interspersed in his works, which he himself begs pardon for in the end of his Mizan al-Amal, the balance of men's actions, where he says that there are three sorts of opinions. 1. Such as are common to the vulgar and agreeable to their notions of things. 2. Such as we commonly make use of in answering questions proposed to us. 3. Such private as a man has to himself, which none understand but those who think just as he does. And then he adds, that though there were no more in what he had written than only this, viz., that it made a man doubt of those things which he had imbibed at first, and helped him to remove the prejudices of education, that even that were sufficient, because he that never doubts will never weigh things aright, and he that does not do that will never see but remain in blindness and confusion. Believe your eyes, but still suspect your ears. You'll need no starlight when the day appears. This is the account of his way of philosophizing, the greatest part of which is enigmatical and full of obscurity, and for that reason of no use to any but such as thoroughly perceive and understand the matter before, and then afterwards hear it from him again, or at least such as are of an excellent capacity, and can apprehend a thing from the least intimation. The same author says in his Al-Jawahir, i.e. the jewels, that he had books not fit to be communicated, but to such only as were qualified to read them, and that in them he had laid down the naked truth. But none of them ever came into Spain that we know of. We have indeed had books, which some have imagined to be those incommunicable ones he speaks of, but 'tis a mistake, for those are Al-Maref al-Aqliya, intellectual notices, and the Al-Nafchi wal-Tezwial, inflation and equation, and besides these, a collection of several questions. But as for these, though there are some hints in them, yet they contain nothing of particular use to the clearing of things, but what you may meet with in his other books. There are, 'tis true, in his Al-Meqsad al-Asna, some things which are more profound than what we meet with in the rest of his books, but he expressly says that that book is not incommunicable, from whence it follows, those books which are come to our hands are not those incommunicable ones which he means. Some have fancied that there were some great matters contained in that discourse of his, which is at the end of his Mashal, i.e. casement, which belief of theirs has plunged them into inextricable difficulties. We're speaking of the several sorts of those who are kept from nearer approaches, by the brightness of the radiation of the divine light, and then of those who had attained to the union, he says of these later, that they apprehended such attributes to belong to the divine essence as were destructive of its unity, from whence it appeared to them that he believed a sort of multiplicity in the Godhead, which is horrid blasphemy. Now I make no question but that the worthy Dr. Al-Ghazali was one of those which attained to the utmost degree of happiness, and to those heights which are proper to those who enjoy the union. But as for his secret or incommunicable books, which contain the manner of revelation, they never came to my hands, and that pitch of knowledge which I have attained to is owing to his other works, and to Avicenna, which I read and compared with the opinions of the present philosophers, till at length I came to the knowledge of the truth. At first, indeed, by way of inquiry and contemplation, but afterwards I came to have a perfect sense, and then I found that I could say something which I could call my own. Now I was resolved that you should be the first, to whom I would communicate what I knew about these matters, both upon the account of the intimacy of our friendship and your candour and integrity. Only observe that my discovering to you the ends which I attained in this way without proving the principles to you first, by which those ends are attained, will do you no more service than any other story which you receive by tradition, or anything told you in general, of which you don't know how to make a particular application. Presuming that you will accept it kindly, not for any merit of the author, but upon the account of our friendship and acquaintance. And I heartily desire that you mayn't stop here, but aspire to a loftier degree, for this is so far from being able to bring you to those heights that is not sufficient to save you. Now I would lead you by the same paths which I have walked in before you, and make you steer by the same compass, till you arrive at the same point, and see with your own eyes what I have seen before you, so as not to take it on trust any longer from me, but to experience it yourself. But this is a matter which will not only require considerable time, but also that you are free and disengaged from all manner of business, and follow it close with great application. And if you are really in earnest and set about it heartily, you will rejoice as one that has travelled all night dews when the sun rises upon him, and will receive a blessing for your labour, and take delight in your Lord, and he will delight in you. And for my own part you will find me, according to your own heart's desire, just such an one as you could wish, and I hope that I shall lead you in the right way, free from evils and dangers. And really I perceive some glimmerings now, by the help of which I shall inflame your desire, and put you upon entering this way, by telling you the story of Hayy Ibn Yaqzan and Asal, and Salaman, as Avicenna calls them, in which those that understand themselves right will find matter of improvement, and that worthy their imitation. The history of Hayy Ibn Yaqzan. Our ancestors of happy memory tell us that there is an island in the Indian Ocean, situate under the equinoctial, where men come into the world spontaneously without the help of father and mother. This island, it seems, is blessed with such a due influence of the sun as to be the most temperate and perfect of all places in the creation, though it must be confessed that such an assertion is contrary to the opinion of the most celebrated philosophers and physicians, who affirm that the fourth climate is the most temperate. Now, if the reason which they give for this assertion, viz., that these parts situate under the equinoctial are not habitable, were drawn from any impediment from the earth, 'tis allowed that it would appear more probable. But if the reason be, because of the intense heat, which is that which most of them assign, 'tis absolutely false, and the contrary is proved by undeniable demonstration. For 'tis demonstrated in natural philosophy that there is no other cause of heat than motion, or else the contact and light of hot bodies. 'Tis also proved that the sun, in itself, is not hot, nor partakes of any mixed quality. 'Tis proved, moreover, that the thickest and smoothest bodies receive light in the greatest degree of perfection, and next to them, the thicker which are not smooth, and those which are very thin receive no light at all. This was first demonstrated by Avicenna, never mentioned before by any of the ancients. From these premises, this consequence will necessarily follow, viz., that the sun does not communicate his heat to the earth, after the same manner as hot bodies heat those other bodies, which are near them, because the sun is not hot in itself. Nor can it be said that the earth is heated by motion, because it stands still and remains in the same posture, both when the sun shines upon it and when it does not, and yet 'tis evident to sense that there is a vast difference in it, in respect of heat and cold, at those several times. Nor does the sun first heat the air and so the earth, because we may observe in hot weather that the air which is nearest the earth is hotter by much than that which is higher and more remote. It remains, therefore, that the sun has no other way of heating the earth but by its light, for heat always follows light, so that when its beams are collected, as in burning glasses, for instance, it fires all before it. Now it is demonstrated in mathematics that the sun is a spherical body, and so is the earth, and that the sun is much greater than the earth, and that part of the earth which is at all times illuminated by the sun is above half of it, and that in that half which is illuminated, the light is most intense in the midst, both because that part is the most remote from darkness, which is the circumference of the circle, as also because it lies opposite to more parts of the sun, and that those parts which are nearest the circumference of the circle have less light, and so gradually, till the circumference of the circle, which encompasses the illuminated part of the earth, ends in darkness. Now that is the centre of the circle of light, where the sun is vertical to the inhabitants, and then in that place the heat is most extremely intense, and so those countries are the coldest, where the sun is farthest from being vertical. And if there were any such place where the sun was always vertical, it must needs be extreme hot. Now 'tis demonstrated in astronomy that the sun is vertical twice a year only to those which live under the equinoctial visi, when he enters into Aries and Libra, and all the rest of the year he declines from them, 6 months northward and 6 months southward, and for that reason they are neither too hot nor too cold, but of a moderate temper between both. There's much more to be said about this argument, in order to the explaining it fully, but it is not suitable to our purpose. I have only hinted it to you, because it helps the story a little, and makes it something more probable that a man may be formed without the help of father and mother. And there are some which affirm positively that Hayy Ibn Yaqzan was so, others deny it, and tell the story thus. They say that there lay not far from this our island another great island very fertile and well-peopled, which was then governed by a prince of a proud and jealous disposition. He had a sister of exquisite beauty, which he confined and restrained from marriage, because he could not match her to one suitable to her quality. He had a near relation whose name was Yaqzān, that courted this princess, and married her privately, according to the rites of matrimony then in use among them. It was not long before she proved with child, and was brought to bed of a son, and being afraid that it should be discovered, she took him in the evening, and when she had suckled him, she put him into a little ark which she closed up fast, and so conveys him to the seashore, with some of her servants and friends as she could trust, and there, with an heart equally affected with love and fear, she takes her last leave of him in these words, O God, Thou formedst this child out of nothing, and didst cherish him in the dark recesses of my womb, till he was complete in all his parts. I, fearing the cruelty of a proud and unjust king, commit him to thy goodness, hoping that thou who art infinitely merciful will be pleased by thy gracious providence to protect him, and never leave him destitute of thy care. Then she set him afloat, and that very night the tide carried him ashore on that island we just now mentioned. It fortuned that the water being high, carried the ark a great way on shore, farther than it would have done at another time, for it rises so high but once a year, and cast the ark into a little shady grove, thick set with trees, a pleasant place, where he was secured both from wind and sun. When the tide ebbed, the ark was left there, and the wind rising blew an heap of sand together between the ark and the sea, sufficient to secure him from any future danger of such another flood. The violence of the waves had loosened the joints of the ark. The boy was hungry and cried. It happened fortunately at that juncture of time that a roe wandering about the island in search of her fawn, which straying was devoured by an eagle, heard the boy cry, and following the voice, imagining it to have been her fawn, came up to the ark, which she immediately attacked, and what with her beating it with her hoofs without, and the boys struggling within, at last between them both they loosened aboard. As soon as she saw him, she showed the same natural affection to him as if he had been her own, suckled him, and took care of him. This is the account which they give, who are not willing to believe that a man can be produced without father or mother. On the other hand, those who affirm that Hayy Ibn Yaqzan was produced in that island without father and mother tell us that in that island, in a piece of low ground, it chanced that a certain mass of earth was so fermented in some period of years that the four qualities, viz. Hot, cold, dry, moist, were so equally mixed that none of them prevailed over the other, and that this mass was of a very great bulk, in which some parts were better and more equally tempered than others, and consequently fitter for generation, the middle part especially, which came nearest to the temper of man's body. This matter being in a fermentation, there arose some bubbles by reason of its viscousness, and it chanced that in the midst of it there was a viscous substance with a very little bubble in it, which was divided into two with a thin partition, full of spirituous and aerial substance, and of the most exact temperature imaginable, that the matter being thus disposed, there was, by the command of God, a spirit infused into it, which was joined so closely to it that it can scarce be separated from it, even so much as in thought, which did as constantly influence this mass of matter as the sun does the world. Now there are some bodies from whence we perceive no reflection of light, as the thin air, others from which we do but imperfectly. Such are thick bodies which are not smooth, but there is a difference in these, and the difference of their colours arises from the different manner of their reception of the rays. And from others we receive the reflection in the highest degree, as from bodies which are smooth and polished, as looking-glasses and the like. so that those glasses, when ground after a particular manner, will collect so much light as to kindle a fire. So that spirit which comes by the command of God does at all times act upon all creatures, in some of which notwithstanding there appears no impression of it, but the reason of that is, because of their incapacity into whom it is infused, of which kind are things inanimate which are fitly represented in this similitude, by the thin air. There are another sort again, in which there does appear something of it, as vegetables and the like, which are represented by the thick bodies we mentioned which are not polished. And then lastly there are others, represented by those glasses, in our last comparison, in which the impressions of this spirit are visible, and such we reckon all sorts of animals. But then, as these smooth and polished bodies, which are of the same figure with the sun, i.e. spherical, do receive the rays in a more plentiful manner than any other whatsoever, so also do some animals receive the influence of that spirit more than others, because they are more like to that spirit, and are formed after his image. Such is man particularly, which is hinted before where 'tis said that God made man after his own image. Now when this form prevails to such a degree that all others are nothing before it, but it remains alone, so as to consume, with the glory of its light, whatsoever stands in its way, then it is properly compared to those glasses, which reflect light upon themselves and burn everything else. But this is a degree which is peculiar to the prophets. But to return and speak something more fully concerning the opinion of those who account for this kind of generation, they tell us that as soon as this spirit was joined to the receptacle, all the other powers immediately, by the command of God, submitted themselves to it. Now, opposite to this receptacle, there arose another bubble divided into 3 receptacles by thin membranes, with passages from one to the other, which were filled with an aerial substance not much unlike that which was in the first receptacle, only the first was something finer, and in each of these 3 ventricles, which were all taken out of one, were placed some of those faculties which were subject to this governing spirit, and were appointed to take care of their respective stations, and to communicate everything, both great and small, to that spirit, which we told you before was placed in the first receptacle. Right against this receptacle, opposite to the second, there arose another 3rd bubble, filled with an aerial substance, which was grosser than that which was in the other 2. This was made for the entertainment and preservation of some other of the inferior faculties. Thus these 3 receptacles were made in the same order which we have described, and these were the first part of that great mass which was formed. Now they stood in need of one another's assistance. The first wanted the other 2 as servants, and they again the assistance and guidance of the first, as their master and director. But both these receptacles, though inferior to the first, were nevertheless superior to all those members which were formed afterwards. The first receptacle, by the power of that spirit which was joined to it, and its continual flaming heat, was formed into a conical figure, like that of fire, and by this means that thick body which was about it became of the same figure, being solid flesh covered with a thick membrane. This is what we call the heart. Now, considering the great expense of moisture, which must needs be where there is so much heat, 'twas absolutely necessary that there should be some part formed whose office it should be continually to supply this defect. Otherwise it would have been impossible to have subsisted long. 'Twas also necessary that this forming spirit should have a sense both of what was convenient for him and what was hurtful, and accordingly attract the one and repel the other. For these services there were 2 parts formed, with their respective faculties, viz. As the brain and the liver. The first of these presided over all things relating to sense, the latter over such things as belonged to nutrition. Both of these depended upon the heart for a supply of heat and the recruiting of their proper faculties. To establish a good correspondence between all these, there were ducts and passages interwoven, some bigger, some lesser, according as necessity required, and these are the arteries and veins. Thus much for a taste. They that tell the story go on farther, and give you a particular account of the formation of all the parts, as the physicians do of the formation of the fetus in the womb, omitting nothing till he was completely formed, and just like an embryo ready for the birth. In this account, they are forced to be beholding to this vast mass of earth, which you are to suppose was of a most exact mixture, and contained in it all manner of materials proper for the making man's body, and those skins, etc., which cover it, till at last, when he was complete in all his parts, as if the mass had been in labour, those coverings, which he was wrapped up in, burst asunder, and the rest of the dirt dried and cracked in pieces. The infant being thus brought into the world, and finding his nourishment fail him, cried for want of victuals, till the roe which had lost her fawn heard him. Now both those who are of the other opinion and those who are for this kind of generation agree in all the other particulars of his education, and what they tell us is this. They say that this roe lived in good pasture, so that she was fat, and had such plenty of milk that she was very well able to maintain the child. She took great care of him, and never left him, but when hunger forced her, and he grew so well acquainted with her that if at any time she stayed away from him a little longer than ordinary, he'd cry pitifully, and she, as soon as she heard him, came running instantly. Besides all this, he enjoyed this happiness, that there was no beast of prey in the whole island. Thus he went on, living only upon what he sucked till he was 2 years old, and then he began to step a little and breed his teeth. He always followed the roe, and she showed all the tenderness to him imaginable, and used to carry him to places where fruit trees grew, and fed him with the ripest and sweetest fruits which fell from the trees, and for nuts or such like, she used to break the shell with her teeth, and give him the kernel, still suckling him as often as he pleased, and when he was thirsty she showed him the way to the water. If the sun shined too hot and scorched him, she shaded him. If he was cold, she cherished him and kept him warm. And when night came, she brought him home to his old place, and covered him partly with her own body, and partly with some feathers which were left in the ark, which had been put in with him when he was first exposed. Now, when they went out in the morning, and when they came home again at night, there always went with them an herd of deer, which lay in the same place where they did, so that the boy, being always amongst them, learned their voice by degrees, and imitated it so exactly that there was scarce any sensible difference. Nay, when he heard the voice of any bird or beast, he'd come very near it, being of a most excellent apprehension. But of all the voices which he imitated, he made most use of the deer's, which he was master of, and could express himself as they do, either when they want help, call their mates, when they would have them come nearer, or go farther off. For you must know that the brute beasts have different sounds to express these different things. Thus he contracted such an acquaintance with the wild beasts that they were not afraid of him, nor he of them. By this time he began to have the ideas of a great many things fixed in his mind, so as to have a desire to some and an aversion to others, even when they were absent. In the meanwhile he considered all the several sorts of animals, and saw that they were all clothed either with hair, wool, or several sorts of feathers. He considered their great swiftness and strength, and that they were all armed with weapons defensive, as horns, teeth, hoofs, spurs, nails, and the like, but that he himself was naked and defenceless, slow and weak, in respect of them. For whenever there happened any controversy about gathering of such ripe fruits as fell from the trees, he always came off by the worst, for they could both keep their own and take away his, and he could neither beat them off nor run away from them. He observed besides that his fellow fawns, though their foreheads were smooth at first, yet afterwards had horns bud out, and though they were feeble at first, yet afterwards grew very vigorous and swift. All these things he perceived in them, which were not in himself, and when he had considered the matter, he could not imagine what should be the reason of this difference. Then he considered such animals as had any defect or natural imperfection, but amongst them all he could find none like himself. He took notice that the passages of the excrements were covered in all other creatures besides himself, that by which they voided their grosser excrements with a tail, and that which served for the voiding of their urine with hair or some such like thing. Besides, he observed that their privy parts were more concealed than his own were. All these things were matter of great grief to him, and when he had perplexed himself very much with the thoughts of them, and was now near 7 years old, he despaired utterly of having those things grow upon him, the want of which made him so uneasy. He therefore resolved to help himself, and thereupon gets him some broad leaves of trees, of which he made 2 coverings, one to wear behind, the other before, and made a girdle of palm trees and rushes twisted together to hang his coverings upon, and tied it about his waist, and so wore it. But alas, it would not last long, for the leaves withered and dropped away, so that he was forced to get more, which he doubled and put together as well as he could, plaiting the leaves one upon another, which made it a little more durable, but not much. Then, having broke a bough from a tree and fitted the ends of it to his mind, he stripped off the twigs and made it smooth. With this he began to attack the wild beasts, assaulting the weaker and defending himself against the stronger. By this means, he began a little to know his own strength and perceived that his hands were better than their feet, because by the help of them he had provided wherewithal to cover his nakedness and also gotten him a defensive weapon, so that now he had no need of a tail, nor of those natural weapons which he had so wished for at first. He was now above 7 years old, and because the repairing of his covering of leaves so often was very troublesome to him, he had a design of taking the tail of some dead beast and wearing it himself. But when he perceived that all beasts did constantly avoid those which were dead of the same kind, it made him doubt whether it might be safe or not. At last, by chance, he found a dead eagle, and observing that none of the beasts showed any aversion to that carcass, he concluded that this would suit his purpose, and in the first place he cuts off the wings and the tail whole and spreads the feathers open. Then he drew off the skin and divided it into 2 equal parts, one of which he wore upon his back, with the other he covered his navel and secrets. The tail he wore behind, and the wings were placed upon each arm. This dress of his answered several ends, for in the first place it covered his nakedness and helped to keep him warm, and then it made him so frightful to the beasts that none of them cared to meddle with him or come near him. Only the roe his nurse, which never left him, nor he her. And when she grew old and feeble, he used to lead her where there was the best food, and pluck the best fruits for her, and give her them to eat. Notwithstanding this, she grew lean and weak, and continued a while in a languishing condition, till at last she died, and then all her motions and actions ceased. When the boy perceived her in this condition, he was ready to die for grief. He called her with the same voice which she used to answer to, and made what noise he could, but there was no motion, no alteration. Then he began to peep into her eyes and ears, but could perceive no visible defect in either. In like manner he examined all the parts of her body, and found nothing amiss, but everything as it should be. He had a vehement desire to find, if possible, that part where the defect was, that he might remove it, and she returned to her former state of life and vigour. But he was altogether at a loss how to compass his design, nor could he possibly bring it about. That which put him upon this search was what he observed in himself. He took notice that when he shut his eyes, or held anything before them, he could see nothing at all, till that obstacle was removed, and so when he put his fingers into his ears, that he could not hear till he took them out again, and when he closed his nostrils together, he smelt nothing till they were opened, from whence he concluded that all his senses and actions were liable to obstacles and impediments, upon the removal of which the same operations returned to their former course. Therefore, when he had examined every external part of her, and found no visible defect, and yet at the same time perceived an universal cessation of motion in the whole body, not peculiar to one member, but common to them all, he began to imagine that the hurt was in some part, which was most remote from the sight, and hidden in the inward part of the body, and that this part was of such nature and use, that without its help, none of the other external parts could exercise their proper functions, and that if this part suffer any hurt, the damage was universal, and a cessation of the whole ensued. This made him very desirous to find that part if possible, that he might remove the defect from it, that so it might be as it used to be, and the whole body might enjoy the benefit of it, and the same course of actions follow as before. He had before observed in the bodies of wild beasts and other animals that all their members were solid, and that there were only 3 cavities, viz., the skull, the breast, and the belly. He imagined, therefore, that this part which he wanted must needs be in one of these cavities, and above all, he had a strong persuasion that it was in the middlemost of them. He verily believed that all the members stood in need of this part, and that from thence it must necessarily follow that the seat of it must be in the centre. And when he reflected upon his own body, he felt such a part in his breast, of which he had this notion, viz., that it was impossible for him to subsist without it, so much as the twinkling of an eye, though he could at the same time conceive a possibility of subsisting without his other parts, viz., his hands, feet, ears, nose, eyes, or even his head. And upon this account, whenever he fought with any wild beast, he always took particular care to guard his breast, because of the apprehension which he had of that part, which was contained in it. Having, by this way of reasoning, assured himself that the disaffected part lay in the breast, he was resolved to make a search in order to find it out, that whatsoever the impediment was, he might remove it if possible. But then again he was afraid on the other side lest his undertaking should be worse than the disease and prove prejudicial. He began to consider next whether or no he had ever remembered any beasts or other animals which he had seen in that condition recover again and return to the same state which they were in before. But he could call to mind no such instance, from whence he concluded that if she was let alone there would be no hopes at all. But if he should be so fortunate as to find that part, and find the impediment, there might be some hope. Upon this he resolved to open her breast and make inquiry, in order to which he provides himself with sharp flints, and splinters of dry cane almost like knives, with which he made an incision between the ribs, and cutting through the flesh, came to the diaphragma, which he finding very tough and not easily broken, assured himself that such a covering must needs belong to that part which he looked for, and that if he could once get through that, he should find it. He met with some difficulty in his work, because his instruments were none of the best, for he had none but such as were made either of flint or cane. However, he sharpened them again and renewed his attempt with all the skill he was master of. At last he broke through, and the first part he met with was the lungs, which he at first sight mistook for that part which he searched for, and turned them about this way and that way to see if he could find in them the cause of the disease. He first happened upon that lobe which lay next the side, which he had opened, and when he perceived that it did lean sideways, he was satisfied that it was not the part he looked for, because he was fully persuaded that that must needs be in the midst of the body, as well in regard of latitude as longitude. He proceeded in his search, till at last he found the heart, which when he saw closed with a very strong cover, and fastened with strong ligaments, and covered by the lungs on that side which he had opened, he began to say to himself, "If this part be so on the other side as it is on this which I have opened, then 'tis certainly in the midst, and without doubt the same I look for, especially considering the conveniency of the situation, the comeliness and regularity of its figure, the firmness and solidity of the flesh, and besides, its being guarded with such a membrane as I have not observed in any part." Upon this he searches the other side, and finding the same membrane on the inside of the ribs and the lungs in the same posture, which he had observed on that side which he had opened first, he concluded the heart to be the part which he looked for. Therefore he first attacks the pericardium, which after a long trial and a great deal of pains he made shift to tear, and when he had laid the heart bare and perceived that it was solid on every side, he began to examine it to see if he could find any hurt in it, but finding none he squeezed it with his hands, and perceived that it was hollow. He began then to think that what he looked for might possibly be contained in that cavity. When he came to open it, he found in it two cavities, one on the right side, the other on the left. That on the right side was full of clotted blood, that on the left quite empty. "Then," says he, "without all doubt, one of those two cavities must needs be the receptacle of what I look for. As for that on this side, there's nothing in it but congealed blood, which was not so, be sure, till the whole body was in that condition in, which it now is, for he had observed that all blood congeals when it flows from the body, and that this blood did not differ in the least from any other. And therefore what I look for cannot by any means be such a matter as this. For that which I mean is something which is peculiar to this place, which I find I could not subsist without, so much as the twinkling of an eye. And this is that which I looked for at first. For as for this blood, how often have I lost a great deal of it in my skirmishes with the wild beasts, and yet it never did me any considerable harm, nor rendered me incapable of performing any action of life, and therefore what I look for is not in this cavity. Now as for the cavity on the left side, I find 'tis altogether empty, and I have no reason in the world to think that it was made in vain, because I find every part appointed for such and such particular functions. How then can this ventricle of the heart, which I see is of so excellent a frame, serve for no use at all? I cannot think but that the same thing which I am in search of once dwelt here, but has now deserted his habitation and left it empty, and that the absence of that thing has occasioned this privation of sense and cessation of motion, which happened to the body. Now when he perceived that the being which had inhabited there before had left its house before it fell to ruin, and forsaken it when as yet it continued whole and entire, he concluded that it was highly probable that it would never return to it any more, after its being so cut and mangled. Upon this the whole body seemed to him a very inconsiderable thing, and worth nothing in respect of that being he believed once inhabited, and now had left it. Therefore he applied himself wholly to the consideration of that being, what it was, and how it subsisted, what joined it to the body, whether it went, and by what passage, when it left the body, what was the cause of its departure, whether it were forced to leave its mansion, or left the body of its own accord, and in case it went away voluntarily, what it was that rendered the body so disagreeable to it as to make it forsake it. And whilst his mind was perplexed with such variety of thoughts, he laid aside all concern for the carcass and threw it away. For now he perceived that his mother, which had nursed him so tenderly and had suckled him, was that something which was departed, and from it proceeded all those actions by which she showed her care of him and affection to him, and not from this unactive body, but that the body was to it only as an instrument or tool, like his cudgel which he had made for himself, with which he used to fight with the wild beasts, so that now all his regard to the body was removed and transferred to that by which the body is governed and by whose power it moves. Nor had he any other desire but to make inquiry after that. In the meantime the carcass of the roe began to putrefy and emit noisome vapours, which still increased his aversion to it, so that he did not care to see it. 'Twas not long after that he chanced to see two ravens engaged so furiously, that one of them struck down the other stark dead, and when he had done, he began to scrape with his claws till he had digged a pit, in which he buried the carcass of his adversary. Our philosopher, observing this, said to himself, "How well has this raven done in burying the body of his companion, though he did ill in killing him? How much greater reason was there for me to have been forward in performing this office to my mother?" Upon this he makes a grave and lays his mother into it, and buries her. He proceeded in his inquiry concerning what that should be by which the body was governed, but could not apprehend what it was. When he looked upon the rest of the roes and perceived that they were of the same form and figure with his mother, he believed that there was in every one of them something which governed and actuated them, like that which had actuated and governed his mother, formerly, and for the sake of that likeness he used to keep in their company and show affection towards them. He continued a while in this condition, contemplating the various kinds of animals and plants, and walking about the coast of his island, to see if he could find anything like himself, as he observed that every individual animal and plant had a great many more like it. But all his search was in vain, and when he perceived that his island was encompassed by the sea, he thought that there was no other land in the world, but only that island. It happened that by collision a fire was kindled among a parcel of reeds or canes, which feared him at first, as being a sight which he was altogether a stranger to, so that he stood at a distance a good while, strangely surprised. At last he came nearer and nearer by degrees, still observing the brightness of its light and marvellous efficacy in consuming everything it touched and changing it into its own nature, till at last his admiration of it and that innate boldness and fortitude which God had implanted in his nature prompted him on, that he ventured to come near it and stretched out his hand to take some of it. But when it burnt his fingers, and he found there was no dealing with it that way, he endeavoured to take a stick, which the fire had not as yet wholly seized upon. So taking hold on that part which was untouched, he easily gained his purpose, and carried it home to his lodging, for he had contrived for himself a convenient place. There he kept this fire and added fuel to it, admired it wonderfully, and tended it night and day, at night especially, because its light and heat supplied the absence of the sun, so that he was extremely delighted with it, and reckoned it the most excellent of all those things which he had about him. And when he observed that it always moved upwards, he persuaded himself that it was one of those celestial substances which he saw shining in the firmament, and he was continually trying of its power by throwing things into it, which he perceived it operated upon and consumed, sometimes sooner, sometimes slower, according as the bodies which he put into it were more or less combustible. Amongst other things which he put in to try its strength, he once flung in some fish which had been thrown ashore by the water, and as soon as he smelt the steam, it raised his appetite, so that he had a mind to taste of them, which he did and found them very agreeable, and from that time he began to use himself to the eating of flesh, and applied himself to fishing and hunting, till he understood those sports very well. Upon this account he admired his fire more and more, because it helped him to several sorts of provision, which he was altogether unacquainted with before. And now when his affection towards it was increased to the highest degree, both upon the account of its beneficial effects and its extraordinary power, he began to think that the substance which was departed from the heart of his mother the roe was, if not the very same with it, yet at least of a nature very much like it. He was confirmed in his opinion, because he had observed in all animals that as long as they lived, they were constantly warm without any intermission, and as constantly cold after death. Besides, he found in himself that there was a greater degree of heat by much in his breast, near that place where he had made the incision in the roe. This made him think that if he could dissect any animal alive, and look into that ventricle which he had found empty when he dissected his dam the roe, he might possibly find it full of that substance which inhabited it, and so inform himself whether it were of the substance with the fire, and whether it had any light or heat in it or not. In order to this he took a wild beast and tied him down, so that he could not stir, and dissected him after the same manner he had dissected the roe, till he came to the heart. And essaying the left ventricle first, and opening it, he perceived it was full of an airy vapour, which looked like a little mist or white cloud, and putting in his finger he found it hotter than he could well endure it, and immediately the creature died. From whence he assuredly concluded that it was that moist vapour which communicated motion to that animal, and that there was accordingly in every animal of what kind soever, something like it upon the departure of which death followed. He had then a great desire to inquire into the other parts of animals, to find out their order and situation, their quantity, and the manner of their connection one with another, and by what means of communication they enjoy the benefit of that moist vapour, so as to live by it. How that vapour is continued the time it remains, from whence it has its supplies, and by what means its heat is preserved. The way which he used in this inquiry was the dissection of all sorts of animals, as well living as dead, neither did he leave off to make an accurate inquiry into them, till at length he arrived to the highest degree of knowledge, in this kind which the most learned naturalists ever attained to. And now he apprehended plainly that every particular animal, though it had a great many limbs and variety of senses and motions, was nevertheless one in respect of that spirit, whose original was from one firm mansion, Visenda, and the heart, from whence its influence was diffused among all the members, and that all the members were subservient to it, or informed and supported by it, and that this spirit made use of those members, in the same manner as a soldier does of his weapons, or an huntsman or fisherman of his tackling, who makes use of different ways and things, according to the difference of the creatures he intends to catch. Now the soldier's weapons are some of them defensive and offensive, and the sportsman's too are some for land and some for water. So the anatomist's instruments are some for fission, others for fraction, and others for perforation. And thus, though the body was one, yet that governing spirit made use of it several ways according to the respective uses of each member, and the several ends which it proposed to obtain. Thus he perceived that there was all this while but one animal spirit, whose action when he made use of the eye was sight, when of the ear, hearing, when of the nose, smelling, when of the tongue, tasting, and when of the skin and flesh, feeling. When it employed any limb, then its operation was motion, and when it made use of the liver, nutrition and concoction. And that, though there were members fitted to every one of these uses, yet none of them could perform their respective offices, without having correspondence with that spirit, by means of the nerves, and that if at any time it chanced that their passages were either broken off or obstructed, such a member would be altogether useless. Now these nerves derive this spirit from the brain, which has it from the heart, and contains abundance of spirit, because it is divided into a great many partitions, and by what means soever any limb is deprived of his spirit, its action ceases, and 'tis like a cast-off tool, not fit for use. And if this spirit depart wholly from the body, or is consumed or dissolved by any means whatsoever, then the whole body is deprived of motion all at once and reduced to a state of death. Thus far had his observations brought him about the end of the 7th year of his age, viz. when he was 21 years old, in which time he had made abundance of pretty contrivances. He made himself both clothes and shoes of the skins of such wild beasts as he had dissected. His thread was made of hair, and of the bark of the stalks of althea, mallows, or any other plants, which afforded such strings as were fit for that purpose. He learned the making of these threads from the use which he had made of the rushes before. He made awls of sharp thorns, and splinters of cane, sharpened with flints. He learned the art of building, from the observations he made upon the swallows' nests. He builds himself a storehouse and a pantry, to lay up the remainder of his provision in, and made a door to it of canes twisted together, to prevent any of the beasts getting in during his absence. He took birds of prey and brought them up for hawking, and kept tame, poultry for their eggs and chickens. He took the tips of the buffalo's horns and fastened them upon the strongest canes he could get, and staves of the tree Yaqzān and others, and so, partly by the help of the fire and partly of sharp-edged stones, he so fitted them that they served him instead of so many spears. He made him a shield of hides folded together. All this pains he took to furnish himself with artificial weapons, because he found himself destitute of natural ones. Now when he perceived that his hand supplied all these defects very well, and that none of all the various kinds of wild beasts durst stand against him, but ran away from him, and were too nimble for him, he began to contrive how to be even with them, and thought there would be no way so proper as to choose out some of the strongest and swiftest beasts of the island, and bring them up tame, and feed them with proper food, till they would let him back them, and then he might pursue the other kinds of wild beasts. There were in that island both wild horses and asses. He chose of both sorts, such as seemed fittest for his purpose, and by exercise he made them so gentle and tractable that he was complete master of his wishes. And when he had made out of the skins of beasts such things as served him competently well, in the room of bridles and saddles, he could very easily then overtake such beasts, as he could scarce ever have been able to have catched any other manner of way. He made all these discoveries whilst he was employed in the study of anatomy, and the searching out of the properties peculiar to each part and the difference between them. And all this about that time I speak of, viz. Of the age of 21 years. He then proceeded further to examine the nature of bodies in this sublunary world, viz. The different kinds of animal, plants, minerals, and several sorts of stones, earth, water, exhalations, ice, snow, hail, smoke, hoar, frost, flame, and heat, in which he observed different qualities and different actions, and that their motions agreed in some respects and differed in others. And considering these things with great application, he perceived that their qualities also agreed in some things, and differed in others, and that so far as they agreed, they were one. But when considered with relation to their differences, a great many, so that when he came to consider the properties of things by which they were distinguished one from another, he found that they multiplied so fast upon him, that 'twas impossible for him to comprehend them. Nay, when he considered the difference of his own limbs, which he perceived were all distinct from one another, by some property and action peculiar to each, it seemed to him that there was a plurality in his own essence. And when he looked upon any one member itself, he found that it might be divided into a great many parts, from whence he concluded that there must needs be a plurality in his own essence, and not only in his own, but in every other also. Then he entered upon another sort of speculation of the second kind, by which he perceived that though the parts of his body were many, yet they were conjoined and compacted together so as to make one body, and that what difference there was between them consisted only in the difference of their actions, which diversity proceeded from that animal spirit, the nature of which he had before searched into, and found out. Now he knew that his spirit was one in essence and was really the substance of his being, and that all the rest of the members served that spirit as instruments, and in this respect he perceived his own essence to be one. He proceeded from hence to the consideration of all the species of animals, and found that every individual of them was one. Next, he considered them with regard to their different species, viz. As roes, horses, asses, and all sorts of birds according to their kinds, and he perceived that all the individuals of every species were exactly like one another, in the shape of their parts, both within and without, that their apprehensions, motions, and inclinations were alike, and that those little differences which were visible amongst them were inconsiderable in respect of those many things in which they agreed. From whence he concluded that the spirit which actuated any species was one and the same, only distributed among so many hearts as there were individuals in that species, so that if it were possible for all that spirit, which is so divided among so many hearts, to be collected into one receptacle, it would be all the same thing, just as if any one liquor should be poured out into several dishes, and afterwards put all together again in one vessel. This liquor would still be the same, as well when it was divided, as when it was altogether only in respect of that division it may be said in some sort to be multiplied. By this way of contemplation he perceived that a whole species was one and the same thing, and that the multiplicity of individuals in the same species is like the multiplicity of parts in the same person, which indeed are not many, i.e. are only one. Then he represented in his mind all the several kinds of animals, and perceived that sensation and nutrition and the power of moving freely where they pleased was common to them all, which actions he was assured before were all very proper to the animal spirit, and that those lesser things in which they differed, notwithstanding their agreement in these greater, were not so proper to that spirit. From this consideration he concluded that it was only one and the same animal spirit which actuated all living creatures whatsoever, though there was in it a little difference, which each species claimed as peculiar to itself. For instance, suppose the same water be poured out into different vessels. That which is in this vessel may possibly be something warmer than that which is in another, though 'tis the same water still, and so every degree of heat and cold in this water in the several vessels will represent the specific difference which there is in animals. And as that water is all one and the same, so is that animal spirit one, though in some respect there is a sort of multiplicity. And so, under this notion, he looked upon the whole species of living creatures to be all one. Afterwards, contemplating the different species of plants, as he had done before of animals, he perceived that the individuals of every species were alike, both in their boughs, leaves, flowers, fruits, and manner of growing. And comparing them with animals, he found that there must needs be some one thing which they did all of them partake of, which was the same to them that the animal spirit was to the living creature, and that in respect of that they were all one. Whereupon, taking a view of all the several kinds of plants, he concluded that they were all one and the same, by reason of that agreement which he found in their actions, viz., their nourishment and growing. Then he comprehended in one single conception the whole kinds of animals and plants together, and found that they were both alike in their nutrition and growing, only the animals excelled the plants in sensation and apprehension, and yet he had sometimes observed something like it in plants, viz., that some flowers do turn themselves towards the sun, and that the plants extend their roots, that way the nourishment comes, and some other such like things, from whence it appeared to him that plants and animals were one and the same, in respect of that one thing which was common to them both, which was indeed more perfect in the one, and more obstructed and restrained in the other, like water that is partly running and partly frozen, so that he concluded that plants and animals were all one. He next considered those bodies which have neither sense, nutrition, nor growth, such as stones, earth, air, and flame, which he perceived had all of them 3 dimensions, viz. Length, breadth, and thickness, and that their differences consisted only in this, that some of them were coloured, others not, some were warm, others cold, and the like. He observed that those bodies which were warm grew cold, and on the contrary, that those which were cold grew warm. He saw that water was rarefied into vapours, and vapours again condensed into water, and that such things as were burnt were turned into coals, allies, flame, and smoke, and if in its ascent it were intercepted by an arch of stone or the like, it thickened there and was like other gross, earthly substances. From whence it appeared to him that all things were in reality one, though multiplied and diversified in some certain respects, as the plants and animals were. Then, considering with himself what that common thing must be, in which the sameness of the animals and plants did consist, he saw that it must be some body, like those bodies, which had a 3-fold dimension, viz., length, breadth, and thickness, and that whether it were hot or cold, it was like one of those other bodies which have neither sense nor nutrition, and differed from them only in those operations which arise from the organical parts of plants and animals, and that, in all likelihood, those operations were not essential, but derived from something else, so that if those operations were to be communicated to those other bodies, they would be like this. Considering it therefore abstractedly with regard to its essence only, as stripped of those operations which at first sight seemed to flow from it, he perceived that it was a body of the same kind with those other bodies, upon which contemplation it appeared to him that all bodies, as well those that had life, as those that had not, as well those that moved, as those that rested in their natural places were one. only there were some actions in some of them which proceeded from their organical parts, concerning which actions he could not yet determine whether they were essential or derived from something without. Thus he continued, considering nothing but the nature of bodies, and by this means he perceived that whereas at first sight things had appeared to him innumerable and not to be comprehended, now he discovered the whole mass and bulk of creatures were in reality only one. He continued in this opinion a considerable time. Then he considered all sorts of bodies, both animate and inanimate, which one while seemed to him to be one, and another a great many. And he found that all of them had a tendency either upward, as smoke, flame, and air when detained under water, or else downward, as water, pieces of earth, or parts of animals and plants, and that none of these. Bodies were free from one or other of these tendencies, or would ever lie still unless hindered by some other body, and interrupted in their course, as when, for instance, a stone in its fall is stopped by the solidity and hardness of the earth. When 'tis plain it would otherwise continue still descending, so smoke still continues going upwards, and if it should be intercepted by a solid arch, it would divide both to the right and left, and so soon as it was freed from the arch, would still continue ascending, and pass through the air which is not solid enough to restrain it. So when a leathern bottle is filled with air and stopped up close, if you hold it under water, it will still strive to get up till it returns to its place of air, and then it rests and its reluctancy and propensity to ascend ceases. He then inquired whether or no he could find any body that was at any time destitute of both these motions, or a tendency toward them, but he could find none such, among all bodies which he had about him. The reason of this inquiry was because he was very desirous to know the nature of body, as such, abstracted from all manner of qualities, from whence arises multiplicity or diversity of kinds. But when he found this too difficult a task for him, and he had examined those bodies which had the fewest qualities, and could find none of them void of one of these two, viz., heaviness or lightness, he proceeded to consider the nature of these two properties, and to examine whether they did belong to body quaternos body, or else to some other quality superadded to body. Now it seemed plain to him that gravity and levity did not belong to body as such, for if so, then no body could subsist without them both, whereas on the contrary we find heavy bodies which are void of all lightness, and also some light bodies which are void of all heaviness, and yet without doubt they both are bodies, in each of which there is something superadded to corporeity, by which they are distinguished one from the other, and that makes the difference between them, otherwise they would be both one and the same thing in every respect. From whence it appeared plainly that the essence both of an heavy and light body was composed of two things: one, which was common to them both, Yaqzān, corporeity; the other, by which they are distinguished one from the other, viz. Gravity in the one and levity in the other, which were superadded to the essence of corporeity. In like manner he considered either bodies, both animate and inanimate, and found their essence confined in corporeity, and in some one thing, or more, superadded to it. And thus he attained a notion of the forms of bodies, according to their differences. These were the first things he found out, belonging to the spiritual world, for these forms are not the objects of sense, but are apprehended by intellectual speculation. Now, among other things of this kind which he discovered, it appeared to him that the animal spirit, which is sealed in the heart, as we have mentioned before, must necessarily have some quality superadded to its corporeity, which rendered it capable of those wonderful actions, different sensations and ways of apprehending things, and various sorts of motions, and that this quality must be its form, by which it is distinguished from other bodies, which is the same that the philosophers call the sensitive soul. And so in plants, that which was in them the same that radical moisture was in beasts, was something proper to them, which was their form, which the philosophers call the vegetative soul, and that there was also in inanimate things, viz. All bodies besides plants and animals, which are in this sublunary world, something peculiar to them, by the power of which every one of them performed such actions as were proper to it, namely various sorts of motion and different kinds of sensible qualities, and that thing was the form of every one of them, and this is the same which the philosophers call nature. And when by this contemplation it appeared to him plainly that the true essence of that animal spirit, which he had been so intent, was compounded of corporeity, and some other quality superadded to that corporeity, and that it had its corporeity in common with other bodies, but that this other quality which was superadded was peculiar to itself. Immediately he slighted and despised the notion of corporeity, and applied himself wholly to that other superadded quality, which is the same that we call the soul, the nature of which he earnestly desired to know. Therefore he fixed all his thoughts upon it, and began his contemplation with considering all bodies, not as bodies, but as endued with forms, from whence necessarily flow these properties, by which they are distinguished one from another. Now, by following up this notion and comprehending it in his mind, he perceived that all bodies had one form in common, from whence one or more actions did proceed, and that there were some of these, which, though they agreed with all the rest in that one common form, had another form besides superadded to it, from whence some actions proceeded. And further, that there was another sort, which, agreeing with the rest in those two forms which they had, was still distinguished from them by a third form, superadded to those other two, from whence also proceeded some actions. For instance, all terrestrial bodies, as earth, stones, minerals, plants, animals, and all other heavy bodies, do make up one in number, which agree in the same form, from whence flows the property of descending continually, whilst there is nothing to hinder their descent. And whensoever they are forced to move upwards, if they are left to themselves, they immediately, by the power of their form, tend downwards again. Now, some part of this number, viz. Plants and animals, though they do agree with all that multitude before mentioned, in that form, yet still have another form superadded to it, from whence flow nutrition and accretion. Now the meaning of nutrition is, when the body that is nourished substitutes in the room of that which is consumed and wasted from itself, something of the like kind, which it draws to itself and then converts into its own substance. Accretion, or growing, is a motion according to the three dimensions, viz. Length, breadth, and thickness, in a due proportion. And these two actions are common to plants and animals, and do without doubt spring from that form which is common to them both, which is what we call the vegetative soul. Now part of this multitude, viz. Animals, though they have the first and second forms in common with the rest, have still a third form superadded, from which arise sensation and local motion. Besides, he perceived that every particular species of animals had some property which distinguished it, and made it quite different from the rest, and he knew that this difference must arise from some form peculiar to that species, which was superadded to the notion of that form which it had in common with the rest of animals. And the like he saw happen to the several kinds of plants, and it was evident to him that the essences of those sensible bodies which are in this sublunary world had some of them more qualities superadded to their corporeity, and others fewer. Now he knew that the understanding of the fewer must needs be more easy to him than the understanding of those which were more in number, and therefore he endeavoured to get a true notion of the form of some one thing, whose essence was the most simple and uncompounded. Now he perceived that the essence of animals and plants consisted of a great many properties, because of the great variety of their operations, for which reason he deferred the inquiring into their forms. As for the parts of the earth, he saw that some of them were more simple than others, and therefore resolved to begin his inquiry with the most simple of all. So he perceived that water was a thing whose essence was not compounded of many qualities, which appeared from the paucity of those actions which arise from its form. The same he likewise observed in the fire and air. Now he had a notion before that all these four might be changed one into another, and therefore there must be some one thing which they jointly participated of, and that this thing was corporeity. Now it was necessary that this one thing which was common them all should be altogether free from those qualities, by which these four were distinguished one from the other, and be neither heavy nor light, hot nor cold, moist nor dry, because none of these qualities were common to all bodies, and therefore could not appertain to body as such, and that if it were possible to find any such body in which there was no other form superadded to corporeity, it would have none of these qualities, nor indeed any other but what were common to all bodies, with what form soever endued. He considered therefore with himself, to see if he could find any one adjunct or property which was common to all bodies, both animate and inanimate. But he found nothing of that nature, but only the notion of extension, and that he perceived was common to all bodies, viz. That they had all of them length, breadth, and thickness. whence he gathered that this property belonged to body as body. However, his sense could not represent to him any body existent in nature, which had this only adjunct, and was void of all other forms, for he saw that every one of them had some other quality superadded to the said extension. Then he considered further whether this threefold extension was the very essence of body or not, and quickly found that besides this extension there was another, in which this extension did exist, and that this extension could not subsist by itself, as also the body which was extended could not subsist by itself without extension. This he experimented in some of those sensible bodies which are endued with forms, for example, in clay, which he perceived, when moulded into any figure, spherical suppose, had in it a certain proportion, length, breadth, and thickness. But then, if you took that very same ball and reduced it into a cubical or oval figure, the dimensions were changed, and did not retain the same proportion which they had before, and yet the clay still remained the same without any change, only that it was necessary for it to be extended into length, breadth, and thickness in some proportion or other, and not be deprived of its dimensions. Yet it was plain to him from the successive alterations of them in the same body that they were distinct from the clay itself, as also that because the clay could not be altogether without them, it appeared to him that it belonged to its essence, and thus from this experiment it appeared to him that body considered as body was compounded of two properties, the one of which represents the clay of which the sphere was made, the other the threefold expression of it when formed into a sphere, cube, or what other figure soever. Nor was it possible to conceive body, but as consisting of these two properties, neither of which could subsist without the other, but that one, namely that of extension, which was liable to change, and could successively put on different figures, did represent the form in all those bodies which had forms, and that other which still abode in the same state, which was the clay in our last instance, did represent corporeity, which is in all bodies, of what forms soever. Now that which we call clay in the foregoing instance is the same which the philosophers call materia prima, the first matter, and uli, which is wholly destitute of all manner of forms. When his contemplation had proceeded thus far, and he was got to some distance from sensible objects, and was now just upon the confines of the intellectual world, he dissident, and inclined rather to the sensible world, which he was more used to. Therefore he retired from the consideration of abstracted body, since he found that his senses could by no means reach it, neither could he comprehend it, and applied himself to the consideration of the most simple sensible bodies he could find, which were those four, about which he had been exercised. And first of all, he considered the water, which he found, if let alone in that condition which its form required, had these two things in it, viz., sensible cold and a propension to move downwards, but if heated by the fire or the sun, its coldness was removed, but its propension to move downwards still remained. But afterwards, when it came to be more vehemently heated, it lost its tendency downwards, and mounted upwards, and so it was wholly deprived of both those properties which used constantly to proceed from it, and from its form. Nor did he know anything more of its form, but only that these two actions proceeded from thence, and when these two ceased, the nature of the form was altered, and the watery form was removed from that body, since there appeared in it actions, which must needs owe their origin to another form. Therefore it must have received another form which had not been there before, from which arose those actions, which never used to appear in it whilst it had the other form. Now he knew that everything that was produced anew must needs have some producer. And from this contemplation there arose in his mind a sort of impression of the maker of that form, though his notion of him as yet was general and indistinct. Then he paused on the examining of these forms which he knew before, one by one, and found that they were produced anew, and that they must of necessity be beholden to some efficient cause. Then he considered the essences of forms, and found that they were nothing else but only a disposition of body to produce such or such actions. For instance, water, when very much heated, is disposed to rise upwards, and that disposition is its form. For there is nothing present in this motion but body, and some things which are observed to arise from it, which were not in it before, such as qualities and motions, and the efficients which produce them. Now the fitness of body for one motion rather than another is its disposition and form. The same he concluded of all other forms, and it appeared to him that those actions which arose from them were not in reality owing to them, but to the efficient cause who made use of these forms to produce those actions which are attributed to them, i.e. the forms, which notion of his is exactly the same with what God's apostle Muhammad says, I am his hearing by which he hears and his seeing by which he sees, and in the Al-Quran, you did not kill them, but God killed them. When thou threwest the darts, it was not thou that threwest them, but God. Now when he had attained thus far so as to have a general and indistinct motion of this agent, he had a most earnest desire to know him distinctly, and because he had not as yet withdrawn himself from the sensible world, he began to look for this voluntary agent among sensible things, nor did he as yet know whether it was one agent or many. Therefore he inquired strictly into all such bodies as he had about him, viz. Those which he had been employed about all along, and he found that they were all liable to generation and corruption, and if there were any which did not suffer a total corruption, yet they were liable to a partial one, as water and earth, the parts of which are consumed by fire. Likewise he perceived that the air was by extremity of cold changed into snow, and then again into water, and among all the rest of the bodies which he was conversant with, he could find none which had not its existence anew, and required some voluntary agent to give it a being. Upon which account he laid them all aside, and transferred his thoughts to the consideration of the heavenly bodies. And thus far he reached in his contemplations about the end of the 4th septenary of his age, viz. When he now 28 years old. Now he knew very well that the heavens, and all the luminaries in them, were bodies, because they were all extended according to the 3 dimensions length, breadth, and thickness, without any exception, and that everything that was so extended was body, ergo they were all bodies. Then he considered next whether they were extended infinitely, as to stretch themselves to an endless length, breadth, and thickness, or whether they were circumscribed by any limits and terminated by some certain bounds, beyond which there could be no extension. But here he stopped a while, as in a kind of amazement. At last, by the strength of his apprehension and sagacity of his understanding, he perceived that the notion of infinite body was absurd and impossible, and a notion wholly intelligible. He confirmed himself in this judgment of his by a great many arguments which occurred to him when he thus argued with himself. That this heavenly body is terminated on this side which is next to me is evident to my sight, and that it cannot be infinitely extended on that opposite side which raised this scruple in me. I prove thus. Suppose 2 lines drawn from the extremity of this heavenly body, on that terminated side which is next to me, which lines should be produced quite through this body in infinitum, according to the extension of the body. Then suppose a long part of one of these lines cut off at this end which is next to me, then take the remainder of what was cut off, and draw down that end of it where it was cut off, and lay it even with the end of the other line from which there was nothing cut off, and let that line which was shortened lie parallel with the other. Then suppose them through this body, till you come to that side which we suppose to be infinite. Either you will find both these lines infinitely extended, and then one of them cannot be shorter than the other, but that which had a part of it cut off will be as long as that which was not, which is absurd. Or else the line which was cut will not be so long as that other, and consequently finite. Therefore, if you add that part to it which was cut off from it at first, which was finite, the whole will be finite, and then it will be no longer or shorter than that line which had nothing cut off from it, therefore equal to it. But this is finite, therefore the other is finite. Therefore the body in which such lines are drawn is finite, and all bodies in which such lines may be drawn are finite, but such lines may be drawn in all bodies. Therefore, if we suppose an infinite body, we suppose an absurdity and impossibility. When by the singular strength of his genius, which he exerted in the finding out such a demonstration, he had satisfied himself that the body of heaven was finite, he desired in the next place to know what figure it was of, and how it was limited by the circumambient superficies. And first he observed the sun, moon, and stars, and saw that they all rose in the east and set in the west, and those which went right over his head described a great circle, but those at a greater distance from the vertical point, either northward or southward, described a lesser circle, so that the least circles which were described by any of the stars were those 2 which went round the 2 poles, the one north, the other south, the last of which is the circle of Tufail or Canopus, the first, the circle of those two stars which are called in Arabic Alpha Kadani. Now because he lived under the equinoctial line, as we showed before, all those circles did cut the horizon at right angles, and both north and south were alike to him, and he could see both the pole stars. He observed that if a star arose at any time in a great circle, and another star at the same in a lesser circle, yet nevertheless as they rose together, so they set together, and he observed it of all the stars, and at all times. From whence he concluded that the heaven was of a spherical figure, in which opinion he was confirmed by observing the return of the sun, moon, and stars to the east, after their setting, and also because they always appeared to him of the same bigness, both when they rose and when they were in the midst of heaven and at the time of their setting, whereas, if their motions had not been circular, they must have been nearer to sight at some times than others, and consequently their dimensions would have appeared proportionably greater or lesser. But since there was no such appearance, he concluded that their motions were circular. Then he considered the motion of the moon and the planets from west to east, till at last he understood a great part of astronomy. Besides, he apprehended that their motions were in different spheres, all which were comprehended in another which was above them all, and which turned about all the rest in the space of a day and a night. But it were too tedious to explain particularly how he advanced in this science. Besides, 'tis taught in other books, and what we have already said is as much as is requisite for our present purpose. When he had attained to this degree of knowledge, he found that the whole orb of the heavens, and whatsoever was contained in it, was as one thing compacted and joined together, and that all those bodies which he used to consider before as earth, water, air, plants, animals, and the like, were all of them so contained in it, as never to go out of its bounds, and that the whole was like one animal, in which the luminaries represented the senses, the spheres so joined and compacted together answered to the limbs, and the sublunary world to the belly in which the excrements and humours are contained, and which oftentimes breeds animals, as the greater world. Now when it appeared to him that the whole world was only one substance, depending upon a voluntary agent, and he had united all the parts of it, by the same way of thinking which he had before made use of in considering the sublunary world, he proposed to his consideration the world in general, and debated with himself whether it did exist in time after it had been, and came to be out of nothing, or whether it had been from eternity, without any privation preceding it. Concerning this matter he had very many and great doubts, so that neither of these two opinions did prevail over the other. For when he proposed to himself the belief of its eternity, there arose a great many objections in his mind, because he thought that the notion of infinite existence was pressed with no less difficulties than that of infinite extension, and that such a being as was not free from accidents produced anew must also itself be produced anew, because it cannot be said to be more ancient than those accidents, and that which cannot exist before accidents produced in time must needs itself be produced in time. Then, on the other hand, when he proposed to himself the belief of its being produced anew, other objections occurred to him, for he perceived that it was impossible to conceive any notion of its being produced anew, unless it was supposed that there was time before it, whereas time was one of those things which belonged to the world and was inseparable from it, and therefore the world could not be supposed to be later than time. Then he considered that a thing created must needs have a creator, and if so, why did this creator make the world now, and not as well before? Was it because of any new chance which happened to him? That could not be, for there was nothing existent besides himself. Was it then upon the account of any change in his own nature? But what should cause that change? Thus he continued for several years, arguing pro and con about this matter, and a great many arguments offered themselves on both sides, so that neither of these two opinions in his judgment overbalanced the other. This put him to a great deal of trouble, which made him begin to consider with himself what were the consequences which did follow from each of these opinions, and that perhaps they might be both alike. And he perceived that if he held that the world was created in time, and existed after a total privation, it would necessarily follow from thence that it could not exist of itself, without the help of some agent to produce it, and that this agent must needs be such an one as cannot be apprehended by our senses, for if he should be the object of sense, he must be body, and if body, then a part of the world, and consequently a created being. Such an one as would have stood in need of some other cause to create him, and if that second creator was body, he would depend upon a third, and that third upon a fourth, and so ad infinitum, which is absurd. Since therefore the world stands in need of an incorporeal creator, and since the creator thereof is really incorporeal, 'tis impossible for us to apprehend him by any of our senses, for we perceive nothing by the help of them, but body or such accidents as adhere to bodies. And because he cannot be perceived by the senses, it is impossible he should be apprehended by the imagination, for the imagination does only represent to us the forms of things in their absence, which we have before learned by our senses. And since he is not body, we must not attribute to him any of the properties of body, the first of which is extension, from which he is free, as also from all those properties of bodies which flow from it. And seeing that he is the maker of the world, doubtless he has the sovereign command over it. Shall not he know it, that created it? He is wise, omniscient. On the other side he saw that if he held the eternity of the world, and that it always was as it now is, without any privation before it, then it would follow that its motion must be eternal too, because there could be no rest before it, from whence it might commence its motion. Now all motion necessarily requires a mover, and this mover must be either a power diffused through the body moved, or else through some other body without it, or else a certain power, not diffused or dispersed through any body at all. Now every power which passeth, or is diffused, through any body, is divided or doubled. For instance, the gravity in a stone, by which it tends downwards, if you divide the stone into two parts, is divided into two parts also, and if you add to it another like it, the gravity is doubled. And if it were possible to add stones in infinitum, the gravity would increase in infinitum too, and if it were possible that that stone should grow still bigger, till it reached to an infinite extension, the weight would increase also in the same proportion, and if on the other side a stone should grow to a certain size and stop there, the gravity would also increase to such a pitch, and no farther. Now it is demonstrated that all body must necessarily be finite, and consequently that power which is in body is finite too. If therefore we can find any power which produces an infinite effect, 'tis plain that it is not in body. Now we find that the heaven is moved about with a perpetual motion, without any cessation. Therefore, if we affirm the eternity of the world, it necessarily follows that the power which moves it is not in its own body, nor in the other exterior body, but proceeds from something altogether abstracted from body, and which cannot be described by corporeal adjuncts or properties. Now he had learned from his first contemplation of the sublunary world that the true essence of body consisted in its form, which is its disposition to several sorts of motion, but that part of its essence which consisted in matter was very mean, and scarce possible to be conceived. Therefore the existence of the whole world consists in its disposition to be moved by this mover, who is free from matter and the properties of body, abstracted from everything which we can either perceive by our senses or reach by our imagination. And since he is the efficient cause of the motions of the heavens, in which, notwithstanding their several kinds, there is no difference, no confusion, no cessation, without doubt he has a power over it, and a perfect knowledge of it. Thus his contemplation this way brought him to the same conclusion it did the other way, so that doubting concerning the eternity of the world and its existence de novo did him no harm at all, for it was plain to him both ways that there was a being which was not body, nor joined to body, nor separated from it, nor within it, nor without it, because conjunction and separation, and being within anything or without it, are all properties of body, from which that being is altogether abstracted. And because all bodies stand in need of a form to be added to their matter, as not being able to subsist without it, nor exist really, and the form itself cannot exist, but by this voluntary agent it appeared to him that all things owed their existence to this agent, and that none of them could subsist but through him, and consequently that he was the cause, and they the effects. Whether they were newly created after a privation, or whether they had no beginning in respect of him, 'twas all one, and creatures whose existence depended upon that being, and that without his continuance they could not continue, nor exist without his existing, nor have been eternal without his being eternal, but that he was essentially independent of them and free from them. And how should it be otherwise, when it is demonstrated that his power and might are infinite, and that all bodies and whatsoever belongs to them are finite? Consequently, that the whole world, and whatsoever was in it, the heavens, the earth, the stars, and whatsoever was between them, above them, or beneath them, was all his work and creation, and posterior to him in nature, if not in time. As, if you take any body whatsoever in your hand, and then move your hand, the body will without doubt follow the motion of your hand, with such a motion as shall be posterior to it in nature, though not in time, because they both began together. So all this world is caused and created by this agent out of time, whose command is, when he would have anything done, be, and it is. And when he perceived that all things which did exist were his workmanship, he looked them over again, considering attentively the power of the efficient, and admiring the wonderfulness of the workmanship, and such accurate wisdom and subtle knowledge. And there appeared to him in the most minute creatures, much more in the greater, such footsteps of wisdom, and wonders of the work of creation, that he was swallowed up with admiration, and fully assured that these things could not proceed from any other than a voluntary agent of infinite perfection, nay, that was above all perfection, such an one to whom the weight of the least atom was not unknown, whether in heaven or earth, no, nor any other thing, whether lesser or greater than it. Then he considered all the kinds of animals, and how this agent had given such a fabric of body to every one of them, and then taught them how to use it. For if he had not directed them to apply those limbs which he had given them, to those respective uses for which they were designed, they would have been so far from being of any service that they would rather have been a burden. From whence he knew that the Creator of the world was supereminently bountiful and exceedingly gracious. And then when he perceived among the creatures any that had beauty, perfection, strength, or excellency of any kind whatever, he considered with himself, and knew that it all flowed from that voluntary agent, whose name be praised, and from his essence and operation. And he knew that what the agent had in his own nature was greater than that which he saw in the creatures, more perfect and complete, more beautiful and glorious, and more lasting, and that there was no proportion between the one and the other. Neither did he cease to prosecute this search, till he had run through all the attributes of perfection, and found that they were all in this agent, and all flowed from him, and that he was most worthy to have them all ascribed to him, above all the creatures which were described by them. In like manner he inquired into all the attributes of imperfection, and perceived that the Maker of the world was free from them all. And how was it possible for him to be otherwise, since the notion of imperfection is nothing but mere privation, or what depends upon it? And how can he any way partake of privation, who is very essence, and cannot but exist, who gives being to everything that exists, and besides whom there is no existence? But he is the being, he is the absoluteness, he the beauty, he the glory, he the power, he the knowledge, he is he, and besides him all things are subject to perishing. Thus far his knowledge had brought him towards the end of the 5th septenary from his birth, viz., when he was 35 years old. And the consideration of this supreme agent was then so rooted in his heart that it diverted him from thinking upon anything else, and he so far forgot the consideration of the creatures and the inquiring into their natures, that as soon as e'er he cast his eyes upon any thing of what kind soever, he immediately perceived in it the footsteps of this agent, and in an instant his thoughts were taken off from the creature and transferred to the Creator, so that he was inflamed with the desire of him, and his heart was altogether withdrawn from thinking upon this inferior world, which contains the objects of sense, and wholly taken up with the contemplation of the upper, intellectual world. Having now attained to the knowledge of this supreme being, of permanent existence, which has no cause of his own existence, but is the cause why all things else exist, he was desirous to know by what means he had attained this knowledge, and by which of his faculties he had apprehended this being. And first he examined all his senses, viz. His hearing, sight, smelling, tasting, and feeling, and perceived that all these apprehended nothing but body, or what was in body. For the hearing apprehended nothing but sounds, and these came from the undulation of the air, when bodies are struck one against another. The sight apprehends colours, the smelling, odours, the taste, savours, and the touch, the temperatures and dispositions of bodies, such as hardness, softness, roughness and smoothness. Nor does the imagination apprehend anything, but as it has length, breadth, and thickness. Now all these things which are thus apprehended are the adjuncts of bodies, nor can these senses apprehend anything else, because they are faculties diffused through bodies, and divided according to the division of bodies, and for that reason cannot apprehend anything else but divisible body. For since this faculty is diffused through the visible body, 'tis impossible, but that when it apprehends anything whatsoever, that thing so apprehended must be divided as the faculty is divided. For which reason no faculty which is seated in body can apprehend anything but what is body or in it. Now we have already demonstrated that this necessarily existent being is free in every respect from all properties of body, and consequently not to be apprehended, but by something which is neither body nor any faculty inherent in body, nor has any manner of dependence upon it, nor is either within it or without it, nor joined to it nor separated from it, from whence it appeared to him that he had apprehended this being by that which was his essence, and gained a certain knowledge of him. And from hence he concluded that this essence was incorporeal and free from all the properties of body, and that all his external part which he saw was not in reality his essence, by that his true essence was that by which he apprehended that absolute being of necessary existence. Having thus learned that this essence was not that corporeal mass which he perceived with his senses and was clothed with his skin, he began to entertain mean thoughts of his body, and set himself to contemplate that noble being, by which he had reached the knowledge of that super-excellent and necessarily existent being, and began to consider with himself, by means of that noble essence of his, whether this noble essence of his could possibly be dissolved, or die, or be annihilated, or whether it were of perpetual duration. Now he knew that corruption and dissolution were properties of body, and consisted in the putting off one form and putting on another. As for instance, when water is changed into air and air into water, or when plants are turned into earth or ashes, and earth again into plants, for this is the true notion of corruption. But an incorporeal being which has no dependence upon body, but is altogether free from the accidents proper to body, cannot be supposed to be liable to corruption. Having thus secured himself in this belief that his real essence could not be dissolved, he had a mind to know what condition it should be in when he had laid aside the body and was separated from it, which he persuaded himself would not be till the body ceased to continue a fit instrument for its use. Therefore he considered all his apprehensive faculties, and perceived that every one of them did sometimes apprehend potentially and sometimes actually, as the eye, when it is shut or turned away from the object, sees potentially. For the meaning of apprehending potentially is, when it does not apprehend now, yet can do it for the time to come. And when the eye is open and turned toward the object, it sees actually, for that is called actual, which is present. And so every one of these faculties is sometimes in power and sometimes in act. And if any of them did never actually apprehend its proper object, so long as it remains in power it has no desire to any particular object, because it knows nothing of any, as a man that is born blind. But if it did ever actually apprehend, and then be reduced to the power only, so long as it remains in that condition it will desire to apprehend in act, because it has been acquainted with the object and is intent upon it, and lingers after it, as a man who could once see and after is blind continually desires visible objects, and according as the object which he has seen is more perfect and glorious and beautiful, his desire towards it is proportionably increased, and his grief for the loss of it so much the greater. Hence it is that the grief of him who is deprived of that sight he once had is greater than his who is deprived of smelling, because she objects of sight are more perfect and beautiful than those of smelling. And if there be anything of boundless perfection, infinite beauty, glory and splendor, that is above all splendor and beauty, so that there is no perfection, beauty, brightness, or comeliness, but flows from it, then certainly he that shall be deprived of the sight and knowledge of that thing, after he has once been acquainted with it, must necessarily, so long as he continues in that state, suffer inexpressible anguish. As on the contrary, he that continually has it present to him must needs enjoy uninterrupted delight, perpetual felicity, and infinite joy and gladness. Now it had been already made plain to him that all the attributes of perfection belonged to that being which did necessarily self-exist, and that he was far from all manner of imperfection. He was certain withal that the faculty by which he attained to the apprehension of this being was not like to bodies, nor subject to corruption, as they are. And from hence it appeared to him that whosoever had such an essence as was capable of apprehending this noble being must, when he put off the body at the time of his death, have been formerly, during his conversation in the body, first, either one who was not acquainted with this necessarily self-existent essence, nor ever was joined to him, nor ever heard anything of him, and so would, at the separating with the body, never to be joined to him, nor to be concerned at the want of him, because all the corporeal faculties cease when the body dies, nor do they any longer desire or linger after their proper objects, nor are in any trouble or pain for their absence, which is the condition of all brutes, of what shape soever they are. Or else, secondly, such an one, who while he continued in the body, did converse with this being, and had a sense of his perfection, greatness, dominion, and power, but afterwards declined from him, and followed his vicious inclinations, till at length death overtook him whilst in this state. He shall be deprived of that vision, and yet be afflicted with the desire of enjoying it, and so remain in lasting punishment and inexpressible torture. Whether he be to be delivered from his misery after a long time, and enjoy that vision which he so earnestly desires, or everlastingly to abide in the same torments, according as he was fitted and disposed for either of these two during his continuance in the body. Or lastly were such an one who conversed with this necessarily self-existent being, and applied himself to it with the utmost of his ability, and has all his thoughts continually intent upon his glory, beauty, and splendour, and never turns from him nor forsakes him, till death seizes him in the act of contemplation and intuition. Such a man as this shall, when separated from body, remain in everlasting pleasure, and delight, and joy, and gladness, by reason of the uninterrupted vision of that self-existent being, and its entire freedom from all impurity and mixture, and because all those sensible things shall be removed from him, which are the proper objects of the corporeal faculties, and which, in regard of his present state, are no better than torments, evils, and hindrances. Being thus satisfied that the perfection and happiness of his own being consisted in the actually beholding that necessarily self-existent being perpetually, so as not to be diverted from it so much as the twinkling of an eye, that death might find him actually employed in that vision, and so his pleasure might be continued without being interrupted by any pain, which Junayd, a doctor and imam of the sect of the Sufians, alluded to, when at the point of death he said to his friends about him, "This is the time when men ought to glorify God and be instant in their prayers." He began to consider with himself by what means this vision might actually be continued without interruption. So he was very intent for a time upon that being, but he could not stay there long before some sensible object or other would present itself. Either the voice of some wild beast would reach his ears, or some fantasy affected his imagination, or he was touched with some pain in some part or other, or he was hungry, or dry, or too cold, or too hot, or was forced to rise to ease nature, so that his contemplation was interrupted, and he removed from that state of mind, and then he could not, without a great deal of difficulty, recover himself to that state he was in before, and he was afraid that death should overtake him at such a time as his thoughts were diverted from the vision, and so should fall into everlasting misery and the pain of separation. This put him into a great deal of anxiety, and when he could find no remedy, he began to consider all the several sorts of animals, and observe their actions, and what they were employed about, in hopes of finding some of them that might possibly have a notion of this being, and endeavour after him, that so he might learn of them which way to be served. But he was altogether disappointed in his search, for he found that they were all wholly taken up in getting their provision, and satisfying their desires of eating and drinking and copulation, and choosing the shady places in hot weather, and the sunny ones in cold, and that all their lifetime, both day and night till they died, was spent after this manner, without any variation, or minding anything else at any time. From whence it appeared to him that they knew nothing of this being, nor had any desire towards it, nor became acquainted with it by any means whatsoever, and that they all went into a state of privation, or something very near akin to it. Having passed this judgment upon the animals, he knew that it was much more reasonable to conclude so of vegetables, which had but few of those apprehensions which the animals had, and if that whose apprehension was more perfect did not attain to this knowledge, much less could it be expected from that whose apprehension was less perfect, especially when he saw that all the actions of plants reached no farther than nutrition and generation. He next considered the stars and spheres, and saw that they had all regular motions and went round in a due order, and that they were pellucid and shining, and remote from any approach to change or dissolution, which made him have a strong suspicion that they had essences distinct from their bodies, which were acquainted with this necessarily self-existent essence, and that these understanding essences were like his understanding essence. And why might it not be supposed that they might have incorporeal essences, when he himself had, notwithstanding his weakness and extreme want of sensible things? That he consisted of a corruptible body, and yet nevertheless all these defects did not hinder him from having an incorporeal, incorruptible essence, from whence he concluded that the celestial bodies were much more likely to have it, and he perceived that they had a knowledge of the necessarily self-existent being, and did actually behold it at all times, because they were not at all encumbered with those hindrances arising from the intervention of sensible things, which debarred him from enjoying the vision without interruption. Then he began to consider with himself what should be the reason why he alone, above all the rest of living creatures, should be endued with such an essence as made him like the heavenly bodies. Now he understood before the nature of the elements, and how one of them used to be changed into another, and that there was nothing upon the face of the earth which always remained in the same form, but that generation and corruption followed one another perpetually in a mutual succession, and that the greatest part of these bodies were mixed and compounded of contrary things, and were for that reason the more disposed to dissolution, and that there could not be found among them all anything pure and free from mixture, but that such bodies as came nearest to it, and had least mixture, as gold and jacinth are of longest duration, and less subject to dissolution, and that the heavenly bodies were most simple and pure, and for that reason more free from dissolution, and not subject to a succession of forms. And here it appeared to him that the real essence of those bodies, which are in this sublunary world, consisted in some of one simple notion added to corporeity, as the four elements, in others of more, as animals and plants, and that those whose essence consisted of the fewest forms had fewest actions and were farther distant from life, and that if there were any body to be found that was destitute of all form, it was impossible that it should live, but was next to nothing at all. Also that those things which were endued with most forms had the most operations, and had more ready and easy entrance to the state of life. And if this form were so disposed, that there were no way of separating it from the matter to which it properly belonged, then the life of it would be manifest, permanent and vigorous to the utmost degree. But on the contrary, whatsoever body was altogether destitute of a form, was illy, matter without life, and near akin to nothing. And that the four elements subsisted with one single form only, and are of the first rank of beings in the sublunary world, out of which other things endued with more forms are compounded. And that the life of these elements is very weak, both because they have no variety of motion, but always tend the same way, and because every one of them has an adversary which manifestly opposes the tendency of its nature, and endeavours to deprive it of its form, and therefore its essence is of short continuance and its life weak, but that plants had a stronger life, and animals a life more manifest than the plants. The reason of which is, because that whenever it happened, that in any of these compound bodies, the nature of one element prevailed, that predominant element would overcome the natures of the rest and destroy their power, so that the compounded body would be of the same nature with that prevailing element, and consequently partake but of a small portion of life because the element itself does so. On the contrary, if there were any of these compounded bodies in which the nature of one element did not prevail over the rest, but they were all equally mixed, and a match one for the other, then one of them would not abate the force of the other, any more than its own force is abated by it, but they would work upon one another with equal power, and the operation of any one of them would not be more conspicuous than that of the rest, and this body would be far from being like to any one of the elements, but would be as if it had nothing contrary to its form, and consequently the more disposed for life, and the greater this equality of temperature was, and by how much the more perfect and further distant from inclining one way or other, by so much the farther it is distant from having any contrary to it, and its life is the more perfect. Now since that animal spirit which is seated in the heart is of a most exact temperature. As being finer than earth and water, and grosser than fire and air, it has the nature of a mean between them all, and which has no manifest opposition to any of the elements, and by this means is fitted to become that form which constitutes an animal. And he saw that it followed from hence that those animal spirits which were of the most even temperature were the best disposed for the most perfect life in this world of generation and corruption, and that this spirit was very near having no opposite to its forms, and did in this respect resemble the heavenly bodies which have no opposite to their forms, and was therefore the spirit of the animal, because it was a mean between all the elements and had no absolute tendency, either upwards or downwards, but that, if it were possible, it should be placed in the middle space, between the centre and the highest bounds of the region of fire, and not be destroyed. It would continue in the same place, and move neither upwards nor downwards. But if it should be locally moved, it would move in a round, as the heavenly bodies do. And if it moved in its place, it would be round its own centre, and that it was impossible for it to be of any other figure but spherical, and for that reason it is very much like to the heavenly bodies. And when he had considered the properties of animals, and could not see anyone among them, concerning which he could in the least suspect that it had any knowledge of this necessarily self-existent being, but he knew that his own essence had the knowledge of it, he concluded from hence that he was an animal, endued with a spirit of an equal temperature, as all the heavenly bodies are, and that he was of a distinct species from the rest of animals, and that he was created for another end, and designed for something greater than what they were capable of. And this was enough to satisfy him of the nobility of his nature, namely, that his viler part, i.e. the corporeal, was most like of all to the heavenly substances, which are without this world of generation and corruption, and free from all accidents that cause any defect, change, or alteration, and that his noble part, viz., that by which he attained the knowledge of the necessarily self-existent being, was something heroical and divine, not subject to change or dissolution, nor capable of being described by any of the properties or attributes of bodies, not to be apprehended by any of the senses or by the imagination, nor to be known by the means of any other instrument but itself alone, and that it attains the knowledge of itself by itself, and was at once the knower the knowledge, and the thing known the faculty and the object. Neither was there any difference between any of these, because diversity and separation are properties and adjuncts of bodies. But body was no way concerned here, nor any property or adjunct of body, having apprehended the manner by which the being like the heavenly bodies was peculiar to him above all other kinds of animals whatever. He perceived that it was a duty necessarily incumbent upon him to resemble them and imitate their actions, and endeavour to the utmost to become like them. He perceived also that in respect of his nobler part, by which he had attained the knowledge of that necessarily self-existent being, he did in some measure resemble it, because he was separated from the attributes of bodies, as the necessarily self-existent being is separated from them. He saw also that it was his duty to endeavour to make himself master of the properties of that being by all possible means, and put on his qualities, and imitate his actions, and labour in the doing his will, and resign himself wholly to him, and submit to his dispensations heartily and unfeignedly, so as to rejoice in him, though he should lay afflictions upon his body and hurt, or totally destroy it. He also perceived that he resembled the beasts in his viler part, which belonged to this generable and corruptible world, viz. This dark, gross body, which solicited him with the desire of variety of sensible objects, and excited him to eating, drinking, and copulation. And he knew that his body was not created and joined to him in vain, but that he was obliged to preserve it and take care of it, which he saw could not be done without some of those actions which are common to the rest of the animals. Thus it was plain to him that there were three sorts of actions which he was obliged to, viz. 1, either those by which he resembled the irrational animals, or 2, those by which he resembled the heavenly bodies, or 3, those by which he resembled the necessarily self-existent being, and that he was obliged to the first, as having a gross body, consisting of several parts and different faculties and variety of motions, to the second as having an animal spirit, which had its seat in the heart, and was the first beginning of the body and all its faculties, to the third, as he was what he was, viz., as he was that being by which he knew the necessarily self-existent being, and he was very well assured before that his happiness and freedom from misery consisted in the perpetual vision of that necessarily self-existent being, without being averted from it so much as the twinkling of an eye. Then he weighed with himself by what means a continuation of this vision might be attained, and the result of his contemplation was this, viz., that he was obliged to keep himself constantly exercised in these three kinds of resemblance. Not that the first of them did any way contribute to the helping him to the vision, but was rather an impediment and hindrance, because it was concerned only in sensible objects, which are all of them a sort of veil or curtain interposed between us and it, but because it was necessary for the preservation of the animal spirit, whereby the second resemblance, which he had with the heavenly bodies, was acquired, and was for this reason necessary, though encumbered with hindrances and inconveniences. But as to the second conformity, he saw indeed that a great share of that continued vision was attained by it, but that it was not without mixture, because whatsoever contemplates the vision after this manner continually, does together with it have regard to and call a look upon his own essence, as shall be shown hereafter. But that the third conformity was that by which he obtained the pure and entire vision, so as to be wholly taken up with it, without being diverted from it one way or other, by any means whatsoever, but being still intent upon that necessarily self-existent being, which whosoever enjoys has no regard to anything else, and his own essence is altogether neglected, and vanished out of sight, and become as nothing. And so are all other essences, both great and small, except only the essence of that one true, necessarily self-existent, high and powerful being. Now when he was assured that the utmost bound of all his desires consisted in this third conformity, and that it was not to be attained without being a long time exercised in the second, and that there was no continuing so long as was necessary for that purpose, but by means of the first, which, how necessary soever, he knew was an hindrance in itself, and an help only by accident, he resolved to allow himself no more of that first conformity than needs must, which was only just so much as would keep the animal spirit alive. Now, in order to this, he found there were two things necessary: the former, to help it inwardly, and supply the defect of that nourishment which was wasted; the latter, to preserve it from without against the extremities of heat and cold, rain and sun, hurtful animals, and such like. And he perceived that if he should allow himself to use these things, though necessary unadvisedly and at adventure, it might chance to expose him to excess, and by that means he might do himself an injury unawares, whereupon he concluded it the safest way to set bounds to himself, which he resolved not to pass, both as to the kind of meat which he was to eat, and the quantity and quality of it, and the times of returning to it. And first he considered the several kinds of those things which were fit to eat, and found that there were three sorts, viz., either such plants as were not yet come to their full growth, nor attained to perfection, such as are several sorts of green herbs which are fit to eat; or secondly, the fruits of trees which were fully ripe, and had seed fit for the production of more of the same kind, and such were the kinds of fruits that were newly gathered and dry; or lastly, living creatures, both fish and flesh. Now he knew very well that all these things were created by that necessarily self-existent being, in approaching to whom he was assured that his happiness did consist, and in desiring to resemble him. Now the eating of these things must needs hinder their attaining to their perfection, and deprive them of that end for which they were designed, and this would be an opposition to the working of the supreme agent, and such an opposition would hinder that nearness and conformity to him, which he so much desired. Upon this, he thought it the best way to abstain from eating altogether, if possible. But when he saw that this would not do, and that such an abstinence tended to the dissolution of his body, which was so much a greater opposition to the agent than the former, by how much he was of a more excellent nature than those things, whose destruction was the cause of his preservation, of two evils he resolved to choose the least, and do that which contained in it the least opposition to the Creator, and resolved to partake of any of these sorts, if those he had most mind to were not at hand, in such quantity as he should conclude upon hereafter. And if it so happened that he had them all at hand, then he would consider with himself, and choose that, in the partaking of which there would be the least opposition to the work of the Creator, such as the pulp of those fruits which were full ripe, and had seeds in them fit to produce others of the like kind, always taking care to preserve the seeds, and neither cut them nor spoil them, nor throw them in such places as were not fit for plants to grow in, as smooth stones, salt earth, and the like. And if such pulpy fruits as apples, pears, plums, etc., could not easily be come at, he would then take such as had nothing in them fit to eat but only the seed, as almonds and chestnuts, or such green herbs as were young and tender. Always observing this rule, that let him take of which sort he would, he still chose those that there was greatest plenty of, and which increased fastest, but so as to pull up nothing by the roots, nor spoil the seed. And if none of these things could be had, he would then take some living creature or eat eggs. But when he took any animal, he chose that sort of which there was the greatest plenty, so as not totally to destroy any species. These were the rules which he prescribed to himself, as to the kinds of his provision. As to the quantity, his rule was to eat no more than just what would satisfy his hunger. And as for the time of his meals, he designed, when he was once satisfied, not to eat any more till he found some disability in himself, which hindered his exercise in the second conformity, of which we are now going to speak. And as for those things which necessity required of him towards the conservation of his animal spirit, in regard of defending it from external injuries, he was not much troubled about them, for he was clothed with skins, and had a house sufficient to secure him from those inconveniences from without, which was enough for him, and he thought it superfluous to take any further care about those things. And as for his diet, he observed those rules which he had prescribed to himself, namely, those which we have just now set down. After this he applied himself to the second operation, viz. Under the imitation of the heavenly bodies, and expressing their proper qualities in himself, which when he had considered, he found to be of three sorts. The first were such as had relation to those inferior bodies, which are placed in this world of generation and corruption, as heat, which they impart to those of their own nature, and cold by accident, illumination, rarefaction, and condensation, and all those other things by which they influence these inferior bodies, whereby they are disposed for the reception of spiritual forms from the necessarily self-existent agent. The second sort of properties which they had were such as concerned their own being, as that they were clear, bright, and pure, free from all manner of feculent matter and whatsoever kinds of impurity. That their motion was circular, some of them moving round their own centre, and some again round the centre of other planets. The third kind of their properties were such as had relation to the necessarily self-existent agent, as their continually beholding him without any interruption, and having a desire towards him, being busied in his service and moving agreeable to his will, and not otherwise, but as he pleased, and by his power. So he began to resemble them in every one of these three kinds to the utmost of his power. And as for his first conformity, his imitation of them consisted in removing all things that were hurtful, either from animals or plants if they could be removed, so that if he saw any plant which was deprived of the benefit of the sun by the interposition of any other body, or that its growth was hindered by its being twisted with or standing too near any other plant, he would remove that which hindered it if possible, yet so as not to hurt either. Or if it was in danger of dying for want of moisture, he took what care he could to water it constantly. Or if he saw any creature pursued by any wild beast, or entangled in a snare, or pricked with thorns, or that had gotten anything hurtful fallen into its eyes or ears, or was hungry or thirsty, he took all possible care to relieve it. And when he saw any watercourse stopped by any stone, or anything brought down by the stream, so that any plant or animal was hindered of it, he took care to remove it. And thus he continued in this first kind of imitation of the heavenly bodies, till he had attained it to the very height of perfection. The second sort of imitation consisted in his continually obliging himself to keep himself clean from all manner of dirt and nastiness, and washing himself often, keeping his nails and his teeth clean, and the secret parts of his body, which he used to rub sometimes with sweet herbs and perfume with odours. He used frequently to make clean his clothes, and perfume them, so that he was all over extremely clean and fragrant. Besides this, he used a great many sorts of circular motion, sometimes walking round the island, compassing the shore, and going round the utmost bounds of it, sometimes walking or running a great many times round about his house or some stone, at other times turning himself round so often that he was dizzy. His imitation of the third sort of attributes consisted in confining his thoughts to the contemplation of the necessarily self-existent being, and in order to this, he removed all his affections from sensible things, shut his eyes, stopped his ears, and refrained himself as much as possible from following his imagination, endeavoring to the utmost to think of nothing besides him, nor to admit together with him any other object of contemplation. And he used to help himself in this by violently turning himself round, in which, when he was very violently exercised, all manner of sensible objects vanished out of his sight, and the imagination, and all the other faculties which make any use of the organs of the body grew weak, and on the other side, the operations of his essence, which depended not on the body, grew strong, so that at some times his meditation was pure and free from any mixture, and he beheld by it the necessarily self-existent being. But then again the corporeal faculties would return upon him, and spoil his contemplation, and bring him down to the lowest degree where he was before. Now when he had any infirmity upon him which interrupted his design, he took some kind of meat, but still according to the aforementioned rules, and then removed again to that state of imitation of the heavenly bodies, in these three respects which we have mentioned. And thus he continued for some time opposing his corporeal faculties, and they opposing him, and mutually struggling one against another, and at such times as he got the better of them, and his thoughts were free from mixture, he did apprehend something of the condition of those who have attained to the third resemblance. Then he began to seek after this third assimilation, and took pains in the attaining it. And first he considered the attributes of the necessarily self-existent being. Now it had appeared to him, during the time of his theoretical speculation, before he entered upon the practical part, that there were two sorts of them, viz., affirmative, as knowledge, power and wisdom, etc., and negative, as immateriality, not only such as consisted in the not being body, but in being altogether removed from anything that had the least relation to body, though at never so great a distance, and that this was a condition not only required in the negative attributes, but in the affirmative too, viz., that they should be free from all properties of body, of which multiplicity is one. Now the divine essence is not multiplied by these affirmative attributes, but all of them together are one and the same thing, viz., his real essence. Then he began to consider how he might imitate him in both these kinds, and as for the affirmative attributes, when he considered that they were nothing else but his real essence, and that by no means it could be said of them that they are many, because multiplicity is a property of body, and that the knowledge of his own essence was not a notion superadded to his essence, but that his essence was the knowledge of his essence, and so vice versa, it appeared to him that if he would know his being, this knowledge, by which he knew his being, would not be a notion superadded to his being, but be the very being itself. And he perceived that his way to make himself like to him, as to what concerned his affirmative attributes, would be to know him alone, abstracted wholly from all properties of body. This he applied himself to, and as for the negative attributes, they all consisted in separation from bodily things. He began therefore to strip himself of all bodily properties, which he had made some progress in before during the time of the former exercise, when he was employed in the imitation of the heavenly bodies. But there still remained a great many relics, as his circular motion, motion being one of the more proper attributes of body, and his care of animals and plants, compassion upon them, and industry in removing whatever inconvenienced them. Now all these things belong to corporeal attributes, for he could not see these things at first, but by corporeal faculties, and he was obliged to make use of the same faculties in preserving them. Therefore he began to reject and remove all those things from himself, as being in no wise consistent with that state which he was now in search of. So he continued, confining himself to rest in the bottom of his cave, with his head bowed down and his eyes shut, and turning himself altogether from all sensible things and the corporeal faculties, and bending all his thoughts and meditations upon the necessarily self-existent being, without admitting anything else besides him. And if any other object presented itself to his imagination, he rejected it with his utmost force, and exercised himself in this and persisted in it to that degree that sometimes he did neither eat nor stir for a great many days together. And whilst he was thus earnestly taken up in contemplation, sometimes all manner of beings whatsoever would be quite out of his mind and thoughts, except his own being only. But he found that his own being was not excluded by his thoughts, no, not at such times when he was most deeply immersed in the contemplation of the first, true, necessarily self-existent being, which concerned him very much, for he knew that even this was a mixture in this simple vision, and the admission of an extraneous object in that contemplation. upon which he endeavoured to disappear from himself and be wholly taken up in the vision of that true being, till at last he attained it, and then both the heavens and the earth, and whatsoever is between them, and all spiritual forms and corporeal faculties, and all those powers which are separate from matter, and are those beings which know the necessarily self-existent being, all disappeared and vanished, and were as if they had never been, and amongst these his own being disappeared too, and there remained nothing but this one true perpetually self-existent being, who spoke thus in that saying of his, which is not a notion superadded to his essence. To whom now belongs the kingdom? To this one, Almighty God. Which words of his Hayy Ibn Yaqzan understood, and heard his voice, nor was his being unacquainted with words and not being able to speak any hindrance at all to the understanding him. Wherefore he deeply immersed himself into this state, and witnessed that which neither eye hath seen nor ear heard, nor hath it ever entered into the heart of man to conceive. And now don't expect that I should give thee a description of that, which the heart of man cannot conceive. For if a great many of those things which we do conceive are nevertheless hard to be explained, how much more difficult must those be which cannot be conceived by the heart, nor are circumscribed in the limits of that world in which it converses. Now, when I say the heart, I don't mean the substance of it, nor that spirit which is contained in the cavity of it, but I mean by it the form of that spirit which is diffused by its faculties through the whole body of man. Now every one of these three is sometimes called the heart, but 'tis impossible that this thing which I mean should be comprehended by any of these three, neither can we express anything by words, which is not first conceived in the heart. And whosoever asks to have it explained, asks an impossibility. For 'tis just as if a man should have a mind to taste colours, quatinous colours, and desire, that black should be either sweet or sour. However, I shall not dismiss you without some limits, whereby I shall point out to you in some measure what wonderful things he saw when in this condition, but all figuratively, and by way of parable, not pretending to give a literal description of that which is impossible to be known, but by coming thither. Attend therefore with the ears of thy heart, and look sharply with the eyes of thy understanding upon that which I shall show thee. It may be thou mayst find so much in it, as may serve to lead thee into the right way. But I make this bargain, that thou shalt not at present require any further explication of it by word of mouth, but rest thyself contented with what I shall commit to these papers. For 'tis a narrow field, and 'tis dangerous to attempt the explaining of that with words, the nature of which admits no explication. I say then, when he had abstracted himself from his own and all other essences, and beheld nothing in nature, but only that one, living and permanent being, when he saw what he saw, and then afterwards returned to the beholding of other things, upon his coming to himself from that state which was like drunkenness, he began to think that his own essence did not at all differ from the essence of that true being, but that they were both one and the same thing, and that the thing which he had taken before for his own essence, distinct from that true essence, was in reality nothing at all, and that there was nothing in him but this true essence, and that this was like the light of the sun which, when it falls upon solid bodies, shines there, and though it be attributed, or may seem to belong to that body upon which it appears, yet it is nothing else in reality but the light of the sun. And if that body be removed, its light also is removed, but the light of the sun remains still after the same manner, and is neither increased by the presence of that body, nor diminished by its absence. Now when there happens to be a body which is fitted for such a reception of light, it receives it. If such a body be absent, then there is no such reception, and it signifies nothing at all. He was the more confirmed in this opinion because it appeared to him before that this true, powerful, and glorious being was not by any means capable of multiplicity, and that his knowledge of his essence was his very essence, from whence he argued thus: He that has the knowledge of this essence has the essence itself. But I have the knowledge of this essence, ergo, I have the essence itself. Now this essence can be present nowhere but with itself, and its very presence is essence, and therefore he concluded that he was that very essence, and to all other essences which were separate from matter, which had the knowledge of that true essence, though before he had looked upon them as many, by this way of thinking, appeared to him to be only one thing. And this misgrounded conceit of his had like to have firmly rooted itself in his mind, unless God had pursued him with his mercy, and directed him by his gracious guidance, and then he perceived that it arose from the relics of that obscurity which is natural to body and the dregs of sensible objects. Because that much and little, unity and multiplicity, collection and separation, are all of them properties of body. But we cannot say of these separate essences, which know this true being, whose name be praised, that they are many or one because they are immaterial. Now multiplicity is because of the difference of one being from another, and there can be no unity but by conjunction, and none of these can be understood without compound notions which are mixed with matter. Besides, that the explication of things in this place is very straight and difficult, because if you go about to express what belongs to these separate essences by way of multitude, or in the plural according to our way of speaking, this insinuates a notion of multiplicity, whereas they are far from being many, and if you speak of them by way of separation, or in the singular, this insinuates a notion of unity, whereas they are far from being one. And here methinks I fee one of those bats whose eyes the sun dazzles, moving himself in the chain of his folly, and saying, "This subtlety of yours exceeds all bounds, for you have withdrawn yourself from the state and condition of understanding men, and indeed thrown away the nature of intelligible things, for this is a certain axiom, that a thing must be either one or more than one. Soft and fair, let that gentleman be pleased to consider with himself, and contemplate this vile sensible world, after the same manner which Hayy Ibn Yaqzan did, who, when he considered it one way, found such a multiplicity in it as was incomprehensible, and then again considering it another way, perceived that it was only one thing, and thus he continued fluctuating, and could not determine on one side more than another. Now, if it were so in this sensible world, which is the proper place of multiplicity and singularity, and the place where the true nature of them is understood, and in which are separation and union, division into parts, and distinction, agreement and difference, what would he think of the divine world, in or concerning which we cannot justly say all nor some, nor express anything belonging to it by such words as our ears are used to, without insinuating some notion which is contrary to the truth of the thing, which no man knows but he that has seen it, nor understands but he that has attained to it. And as for his saying that I have withdrawn myself from the state and condition of understanding men, and thrown away the nature of intelligible things, I grant it, and leave him to his understanding, and his understanding men he speaks of. For that understanding which he, and such as he mean, is nothing else but that rational faculty which examines the individuals of sensible things, and from thence gets an universal notion. And those understanding men he means are those which make use of this sort of separation. But that kind, which we are now speaking of, is above all this, and therefore let every one that knows nothing but sensible things and their universals shut his ears and pack away to his company, who know the outside of the things of this world, but take no care of the next. But if thou art one of them to whom these limits and signs by which we describe the divine world are sufficient, and dost not put that sense upon my words, in which they are commonly used, I shall give thee some farther account of what Hayy Ibn Yaqzan saw when he was in the state of those who have attained to the truth, of which we have made mention before, and it is thus. After he was wholly immersed in the speculation of these things, and perfectly abstracted from all other objects, and in the nearest approach, he saw in the highest sphere, beyond which there is no body, a being free from matter, which was not the being of that one true one, nor the sphere itself, nor yet anything different from them both, but was like the image of the sun which appears in a well-polished looking-glass, which is neither the sun nor the looking-glass, and yet not distinct from them. And he saw in the essence of that separate sphere such perfection, splendor, and beauty, as is too great to be expressed by any tongue, and too subtle to be clothed in words. And he perceived that it was in the utmost perfection of delight and joy, exultation and gladness, by reason of its beholding that true essence, whose glory be exalted. He saw also that the next sphere to it, which is that of the fixed stars, had an immaterial essence, which was not the essence of that true one, nor the essence of that highest separated sphere, nor the sphere itself, and yet not different from these, but is like the image of the sun which is reflected upon a looking-glass, from another glass placed opposite to the sun, and he observed in this essence also the like splendor, beauty, loveliness, and pleasure, which he had observed in the essence of the other highest sphere. He saw likewise that the next sphere, which is the sphere of Saturn, had an immaterial essence, which was none of those essences he had seen before, nor yet different from them, but was like the image of the sun, which appears in a glass, upon which it is reflected from a glass which received that reflection from another glass, placed opposite to the sun. And he saw in this essence too the same splendor and delight which he had observed in the former. And so in all the spheres he observed distinct, immaterial essences, every one of which was not any of those which went before it, not yet different from them, but was like the image of the sun reflected from one glass to another, according to the order of the spheres. And he saw in every one of these essences such beauty, splendor, pleasure, and joy, as eye hath not seen nor ear heard, nor hath it entered into the heart of man to conceive. And so downwards, till he came to the lower world, subject to generation and corruption, which comprehends all that which is contained within the sphere of the moon, which he perceived had an immaterial essence as well as the rest, not the same with any of those which he had seen before, nor different from them, and that this essence had 70,000 faces, and every face 70,000 mouths, and every mouth 70,000 tongues, with which it praised, sanctified and glorified incessantly the essence of that one true being. And he saw that this essence, which he had supposed to be many though it was not, had the same perfection and pleasure which he had seen in the other, and that this essence was like the image of the sun, which appears in fluctuating water, which has that image reflected upon it from the last and lowermost of those glasses, to which the reflection came, according to the forementioned order, from the first glass which was set opposite to the sun. Then he perceived that he himself had a separate essence, which one might call a part of that essence which had 70,000 faces, if that essence had been capable of division, and if that essence had not been created in time, one might say it was the very same, and had it not been joined to the body so soon as it was created, we should have thought that it had not been created. And in this order he saw other essences also, like his own, which had necessarily been heretofore, then were dissolved, and afterwards necessarily existed together with himself, and that they were so many as could not he numbered, if we might call them many, or that they were all one, if we might call them one. And he perceived both in his own essence, and in those other essences which were in the same rank with him, infinite beauty, brightness and pleasure, such as neither eye hath seen, nor ear heard, nor hath it entered into the heart of man, and which none can describe nor understand, but those which have attained to it and experimentally know it. Then he saw a great many other immaterial essences, which resembled rusty looking-glasses, covered over with filth, and besides, turned their backs upon, and had their faces averted from those polished looking-glasses that had the image of the sun imprinted upon them. And he saw that these essences had so much filthiness adhering to them, and such manifold defects as he could not have conceived. And he saw that they were afflicted with infinite pains, which caused incessant sighs and groans, and that they were compassed about with torments, as those who lie in a bed are with curtains, and that they were scorched with the fiery veil of separation. But after a very little while his senses returned to him again, and he came to himself out of this state, as out of an ecstasy, and his foot sliding out of this place, he came within sight of this sensible world, and lost the sight of the divine world, for there is no joining them both together in the same state. For this world in which we live, and that other are like two wives belonging to the same husband. If you please one, you displease the other. Now if you should object that it appears from what I have said concerning this vision, that those separated essences, if they chance to be in bodies of perpetual duration, as the heavenly bodies are, shall also remain perpetually, but if they be in a body which is liable to corruption, such an one as belongs to us reasonable creatures, that then they must perish too, and vanish away, as appears from the similitude of the looking-glasses which I have used to explain it, because the image there has no duration of itself, but what depends upon the duration of the looking-glass, and if you break the glass, the image is most certainly destroyed and vanishes. In answer to this I must tell you that you have soon forgot the bargain I made with you. For did not I tell you before that it was a narrow field, and that we had but little room for explication, and that words, however used, would most certainly occasion men to think otherwise of the thing than really it was? Now that which has made you imagine this is because you thought that the similitude must answer the thing represented in every respect. But that will not hold in any common discourse, how much less in this, where the sun and its light, and its image, and the representation of it, and the glasses, and the forms which appear in them, are all of them things which are inseparable from body, and which cannot subsist but by it and in it, and therefore the very essences of them depend upon body, and they perish together with it. But as for the divine essences and heroic spirits, they are all free from body and all its adherents, and removed from them at the utmost distance, nor have they any connection or dependence upon them. And the existing or not existing of body is all one to them, for their sole connection and dependence is upon that one true necessary self-existent being, who is the first of them, and the beginning of them, and the cause of their existence, and he perpetuates them and continues them forever. Nor do they want the bodies, but the bodies want them. For if they should perish, the bodies would perish, because these essences are the principles of these bodies. In like manner, as if a privation of that one true being could be supposed, far be it from him, for there is no God but him, all these essences would be removed together with him, and the bodies too, and all the sensible world, because all these have a mutual connection. Now though the sensible world follows the divine world, as a shadow does the body, and the divine world stands in no need of it, but is free from it, and independent of it, yet notwithstanding this, it is absurd to suppose a possibility of its being annihilated, because it follows the divine world. But the corruption of this world consists in its being changed, not annihilated. And that glorious book spake, where there is no mention made of moving the mountains and making them like the world, and men like fireflies and darkening the sun and moon, and eruption of the sea, in that day when the earth shall be changed into another earth, and the heavens likewise. And this is the substance of what I can hint to you at present concerning what Hayy Ibn Yaqzan saw when in that glorious state. Don't expect that I should explain it any farther with words, for that is even impossible. But as for what concerns the finishing his history, that I shall tell you, God willing. After his return to the sensible world, when he had been where we have told you, he loathed this present life, and most earnestly longed for the life to come, and he endeavoured to return to the same state, by the same means he had sought it at first, till he attained to it with less trouble than he did at first, and continued in it the second time longer than at the first. Then he returned to the sensible world, and then again endeavoured to recover his station, which he found easier than at the first and second time, and that he continued in it longer, and thus it grew easier and easier, and his continuance in it longer and longer time after time, till at last he could attain it when he pleased, and stay in it as long as he pleased. In this state he firmly kept himself, and never retired from it, but when the necessities of his body required it, which he had brought into as narrow a compass as was possible. And whilst he was thus exercised, he used to with that it would please God to deliver him altogether from this body of his, which detained him from that state, that he might have nothing to do but to give himself up wholly to his delight, and be freed from all that torment with which he was afflicted, as often as he was forced to avert his mind from that state, by attending on the necessities of nature. And thus he continued, till he was past the 7th septenary of his age, that is, till he was about 50 years of age, and then he happened to be acquainted with Asal, the narrative of which meeting of theirs we shall now, God willing, relate. They say that there was an island not far from that, where Hayy Ibn Yaqzan was born, no matter according to which of those two different accounts they give of his birth, into which one of those good sects, which had some one of the ancient prophets of pious memory for its author, had retired. A sect which used to discourse of all things in nature, by way of parable and similitude, and by that means represent the images of them to the imagination, and fix the impressions of them in men's minds, as is customary in such discourses as are made to the vulgar. This sect so spread itself in this island, and prevailed and grew so eminent, that at last the king not only embraced it himself, but obliged his subjects to do so too. Now there were born in this island 2 men of extraordinary endowments, and lovers of that which is good. The name of the one was Asal, and the other Salaman, who, meeting with this sect, embraced it heartily, and obliged themselves to the punctual observance of all its ordinances, and the daily exercise of what was practised in it. And to this end they entered into a league of friendship with each other. Now, among other passages contained in the law of that sect, they sometimes made inquiry into these words, wherein it treats of the description of the most high and glorious God, and his angels, and the resurrection, and the rewards and punishments of a future state. Now Asal used to make a deeper search into the inside of things, and was more inclined to study mystical meanings and interpretations. But as for his friend Salaman, he kept close to the literal sense, and never troubled himself with such interpretations, but refrained from such curious examination and speculation of things. However, notwithstanding this difference, they both were constant in performing those ceremonies required, and in calling themselves to an account, and in opposing their affections. Now there were in this law some passages which seemed to exhort men to retirement and a solitary life, intimating that happiness and salvation were to be attained by it, and others which seemed to encourage men to conversation and the embracing human society. Asal gave himself up wholly to retirement, and those expressions which favoured it were of most weight with him, because he was naturally inclined to contemplation and searching into the meanings of things, and his greatest hope was that he should best attain his end by a solitary life. Salaman, on the other side, applied himself to conversation, and those sayings of the law which tended that way went the farthest with him, because he had a natural aversion to contemplation and nice sifting of things, and he thought that conversation did drive away evil thoughts and banished that diversity of opinions which offered themselves to his mind, and kept him from the suggestions of evil thoughts. In short, their disagreement in this particular was the occasion of their parting. Now Asal had heard of that island in which we have told you that Hayy Ibn Yaqzan had his breeding. He knew also its fertility and conveniences, and the healthful temper of the air, so that it would afford him such a commodious retirement as he had in his wishes. Thither he resolved to go and withdraw himself from all manner of conversation the remaining part of his days. So he took what substance he had, and with part of it he hired a ship to convey him thither. The rest he distributed among the poor people, and took his leave of his friend Salaman, and went aboard. The mariners transported him to the island, and set him ashore and left him. There he continued serving God, and magnifying him and fancifying him, and meditating upon his glorious names and attributes, without any interruption or disturbance. And when he was hungry, he took what he had occasion for to satisfy his hunger, of such fruits as the island afforded, or what he could hunt. And in this state he continued a while, in the meantime enjoying the greatest pleasure imaginable, and the most entire tranquillity of mind, arising from the converse and communication which he had with his Lord, and every day experiencing his benefits and precious gifts, and his bringing easily to his hand such things as he wanted, and were necessary for his support, which confirmed his belief in him, and was a great refreshment to him. Hayy Ibn Yaqzan in the meantime was wholly immersed in his sublime speculations, and never stirred out of his cell but once a week, to take such provision as first came to hand. So that Asal did not light upon him at first, but walked round the island and compassed the extremities of it, without seeing any man, or so much as the footsteps of any. Upon which account his joy was increased, and his mind exceedingly pleased, in regard of his comparing that which he had proposed to himself, namely to lead the most retired life that was possible. At last it happened, one time that Hayy Ibn Yaqzan coming out to look for provision in the same place whither Asal was retired, they spied one another. Asal, for his part, did not question, but that it was some religious person, who for the sake of a solitary life had retired into that island, as he had done himself, and was afraid, lest if he should come up to him, and make himself known, it might spoil his meditation, and hinder his attaining what he hoped for. Hayy Ibn Yaqzan on the other side could not imagine what it was, for of all the creatures he had ever beheld in his whole life, he had never seen anything like it. Now Asal had a black coat on, made with hair and wool, which Hayy Ibn Yaqzan fancied was natural, and stood wondering at it a long time. Asal ran away as hard as he could, for fear he should disturb his meditation. Hayy Ibn Yaqzan ran after him, out of an innate desire he had to know the truth of things. But when he perceived Asal make so much haste, he retired a little and hid himself from him, so that Asal thought he had been quite gone off, and then he fell to his prayers, and reading and invocation and weeping, and supplication and complaining till he was altogether taken up, so as to mind nothing else. In the meantime Hayy Ibn Yaqzan stole upon him by degrees, and Asal took no notice of him, till he came so near as to hear him read and praise God, and observed his humble behaviour and his weeping, and heard a pleasant voice and distinct words such as he had never observed before in any kind of animals. Then he looked upon his shape and lineaments, and perceived that he was of the same form with himself, and was satisfied that the coat he had on was not a natural skin but an artificial habit like his own. And when he observed the decency of his humble behaviour and his supplication and weeping, he did not at all question but that he was one of those essences which had the knowledge of the True One, and for that reason he had a desire to be acquainted with him, and to know what was the matter with him, and what caused this weeping and supplication. Whereupon he drew nearer to him, till Asal, perceiving it, betook himself to his heels again, and Hayy Ibn Yaqzan, answerably to his vigour and power both of knowledge and body, which God had bestowed upon him, pursued him with all his might, till at last he overtook him and seized on him, and held him fast so that he could not get away. When Asal looked upon him and saw him clothed with the skins of wild beasts with the hair on, and his own hair so long as to cover a great part of his body, and observed his great swiftness and strength, he was very much afraid of him, and began to pacify him with stroking him and entreating him. But Hayy Ibn Yaqzan did not understand one word he said, nor knew anything of his meaning, only he perceived that he was afraid, and endeavoured to allay his fear with such voices as he had learned of some of the beasts, and stroked his head and both sides of his neck, and showed kindness to him, and expressed a great deal of gladness and joy, till at last Asal's fear was laid aside, and he knew that he meant him no harm. Now Asal, long before, out of his earnest desire of searching into the meaning of things, had studied most languages, and was well skilled in them. So he began to speak to Hayy Ibn Yaqzan in all the languages which he understood, and ask him questions concerning his way of life, and took pains to make him understand him. But all in vain, for Hayy Ibn Yaqzan stood all the while wondering at what he heard, and did not know what was the meaning of it, only he perceived that Asal was pleased and well affected towards him, and thus they stood wondering one at another. Now Asal had by him some remainder of the provision, which he had brought along with him, from the inhabited island from whence he came, and he offered it to Hayy Ibn Yaqzan, who did not know what to make on't, for he had never seen any such before. Then Asal eat some of it himself, and invited Hayy Ibn Yaqzan by signs to eat too. But Hayy Ibn Yaqzan bethought himself of those rules which he had prescribed to himself, as to matter of diet, and not knowing the nature of that which he offered him, nor whether it was lawful for him to partake of it or not, he refused it. Asal still continued urgent, and invited him kindly. Now Hayy Ibn Yaqzan had a great desire to be acquainted with him, and was afraid that his continuing too stiff in his refusal might alienate his affections from him, so he ventured upon it, and eat some. And when he had tasted of it, and liked it, he perceived that he had done amiss in breaking those promises which he had made to himself concerning diet, and he repented himself of what he had done, and had thoughts of withdrawing himself from Asal, and retreating to his former state of contemplation. But the vision did not easily appear to him at first, upon which he resolved to continue with Asal in the sensible world, till he had thoroughly satisfied himself concerning him, that so when he had no further desire towards him, he might apply himself to his former contemplations without any interruption. Wherefore he applied himself to the society of Asal, who, perceiving that he could not speak, was secure of any damage that might come to his religion by keeping company with him, and besides had hopes of teaching him speech, knowledge, and religion, and by that means of obtaining a great reward and near approach to God. He began therefore to teach him how to speak, first by showing him particular things and pronouncing their names, and repeating them often, and persuading him to speak them, which he did, applying every word to the thing by it signified, till he had taught him all the nouns, and so improved him by degrees, that he could speak in a very short time. Then Asal began to inquire of him concerning his way of living, and from whence he came into that island. And Hayy Ibn Yaqzan told him that he knew nothing of his own original, nor any father or mother that he had, but only that roe which brought him up. Then he described to him his manner of living, from first to last, and by what degrees he advanced in knowledge, till he attained the union with God. When Asal heard him give an account of those truths and those essences which are separate from the sensible world, and which have the knowledge of that True One, whose name be praised, and heard him give an account of the essence of that True One, and describe as far as was possible what he witnessed, when he had attained to that union, of the joys of those who are near united to God, and the torments of those who are separated from him. He made no doubt, but that all those things which are contained in the law of God, i.e. the Alcoran concerning his command, his angels, books and messengers, the day of judgment, paradise and hell, were resemblances of what Hayy Ibn Yaqzan had seen, and the eyes of his understanding were opened, and he found that the original and the copy did exactly agree together. And the ways of mystical interpretation became easy to him, and there appeared nothing difficult to him in those precepts which he had received, but all was clear, nor anything shut up, but all was open, nor anything profound, but all was plain. By this means his intellectual faculty grew strong and vigorous, and he looked upon Hayy Ibn Yaqzan with admiration and respect, and assured himself that he was one of the saints of God, which have no fear upon them, neither shall they suffer pain. Upon which he addressed himself to wait upon him, and imitate him, and to follow his direction in the performance of such works as he had occasion to make use of, namely, those legal ones which he had formerly learned from his own sect. Then Hayy Ibn Yaqzan began to inquire of him concerning his condition and manner of living, and Asal gave him an account of the island from whence he came, and what manner of people inhabited it, and what sort of life they led before that religious sect which we mentioned came among them, and how it was now, since the coming of that sect. He also gave him an account of what was delivered in the law, i.e. Al-Quran, relating to the description of the divine world, paradise and hell, and the awakening and resurrection of mankind, and their gathering together to judgment, and the balance and the way. All which things Hayy Ibn Yaqzan understood very well, and did not find any of them disagreeable to what he had seen, when in that noble station, and he knew that he that had described these things, and given an account of them, had given a true account, and was a messenger sent from his Lord, and he believed him and affirmed his veracity and bore witness to his message. Then he began to ask him concerning the precepts which the messenger of God had delivered, and the rites of worship which he had ordained. And Asal told him of prayer, alms, fasting and pilgrimage, and such other external observances, which he received and practiced and took upon himself in obedience to his command, of whose veracity he was very well allured. Only there were two things stuck in his mind, which he wondered at, and could not comprehend wherein the wisdom of them did consist. The one was, why this messenger of God, in describing most things which relate to the divine world, used to express them to men by parables or similitudes, and waved a perspicuous explication of them, by which occasioned men in a great measure to fall into that error of asserting a corporeity in God, and believing things of that true being, from which he is absolutely free. And so in like manner concerning those things which relate to the rewards and punishments of a future state. The other was, why he went no farther than these precepts and rites of worship, but gave men leave to gather riches, and allowed them a liberty as to matter of food, by which means they employed themselves about vain things, and turned away from the truth, whereas his judgment was, that no body ought to eat anything, but only just to keep him alive. And as for riches, he had no opinion of them at all. And when he saw what was set down and prescribed in the law, with relation to wealth, as alms, and the distribution of them, and trading and usury, mulcts and punishments, these things seemed all very odd to him, and he judged them superfluous, and said that if men understood things aright, they would lay aside all these vain things, and follow the truth, and content themselves without anything of all this, and that no man would challenge such a propriety in riches as to have alms asked of him, or to cause his hands to be cut off, who privily stole them, or their lives to be taken away, who had openly robbed him. Now that which prompted him to this persuasion was this, that he thought all men were endued with an ingenuous temper and penetrating understanding, and a mind constant to itself, and was not aware how blockish and stupid they were, how ill-advised and inconstant in their resolutions, insomuch that they are like brute beasts, nay, more apt to wander out of the way. Since therefore he was greatly affected with pity towards mankind, and desired that he might be an instrument of their salvation, a resolution came into his mind of going over to them, to declare and lay before them the truth. This intention of his he communicated to his friend Asal, and asked him if there could possibly be any way contrived to come at them. But Asal told him what sort of people they were, and how far from an ingenuous temper, and how averse from obeying the commands of God, but he had no notion of that, but still his mind was intent upon that which he hoped to compass. And Asal desired that it would please God by his means to direct some of his acquaintance which were of a more pliable temper than the rest, and had more sincerity in them, into the right way. So then he was ready to further the design and endeavour of Hayy Ibn Yaqzan, upon which they resolved to keep close to the seashore, without stirring from it either day or night, till God should please to afford them an opportunity of crossing the sea. And all the while they were intent upon this, they continued praying to God to direct them in this their business, and bring it to an happy issue. At last, as God, whose name be praised, would have it, it happened that a ship which had lost her course was driven by the wind and water upon the shore of that island. And as it drew nearer to land, they who were in it, seeing two men upon the shore, made towards them. Then Asal spoke to them, and desired them to carry him and his companion along with them in the ship, to which they contented, and took them into the ship. And it pleased God to send them a fair wind, which in a short time carried them to the isle which they desired. There they landed, and went into the city. And Asal's friends came all about him, and he gave them an account of Hayy Ibn Yaqzan and his manner of living, so that people flocked to him from every side, and admired and reverenced him. Then Asal told him that this sect was superior to all other sorts of men in knowledge and sagacity, and that if he could not work upon them, there were much lesser hopes of doing any good upon the vulgar. Now Salaman, Asal's friend, who we told you chose conversation rather than solitude and retirement, which he judged unlawful, was prince and sovereign of this island. So Hayy Ibn Yaqzan began to teach them, and explain the mysteries of wisdom to them. But so soon as e'er he began to raise his discourse above external things a little, and to inculcate that, the contrary whereof had been settled, and deeply rooted in their minds, they began to withdraw themselves from him, and their minds had an abhorrence for what he spake. And though they carried themselves civilly to him, both because he was a stranger, and out of the observance which they thought due to their friend Asal, yet they were angry with him inwardly in their hearts. However, he continued reasoning with them mildly night and day, and teaching them the truth, both in private and public, which only increased their hatred towards him, and made them avoid his company, though otherwise they were lovers of goodness, and desirous of truth. However, through the defect of their nature, they did not search for it after the right manner, nor apprehend it as they should do, but sought the knowledge of it after the common way, like the rest of the world, so that he despaired of doing any good upon them, and all his hopes of amending them were defeated, because they were not willing to receive what he taught them. And afterwards, taking a view of the several ranks and orders of men, he perceived that every sort of them placed their delight in those things which they possessed at present, and that their appetites were their God, and that they lost themselves in gathering up the little things of this world, and that the desire of getting more kept them employed till they came to their graves, and that all good counsel was lost upon them, and that disputing with them had only this effect, that it made them the more obstinate. And as for wisdom, there was no way for them to attain it, neither had they any share in it. For folly has overwhelmed them, and what they have sought after has covered their hearts like raft. God has sealed up their hearts and their ears, and their eyes are dim, and they shall have sore punishment. When therefore he saw them compassed about with the curtains of punishment, and covered with the darkness of the veil, and that all of them, a few only excepted, minded their religion no otherwise, but with regard to this present world, and cast the observance of religious performances behind their backs, notwithstanding the easiness of them, and sold them for a small price, and that their merchandise and trading diverted them from thinking upon God, so that they had no fear of that day in which both their hearts and eyes shall be turned round. He was fully satisfied that it was to no purpose to speak to them plainly, neither that it was expedient any work should be enjoined them beyond this measure, and that the greatest benefit which accrued to the common sort of men by the law was wholly placed in relation to things of this world, viz., that they might be in a comfortable way of living, and that no man might invade another's property, and that there was but here and there one that attained to happiness hereafter, namely, such an one as made it his business in this world to provide for another, and took due care about it, and was a believer. But that hell was the place for him that erred from the truth, and preferred the life of this present world before it. And what labour can be greater, or what misery more complete than his, who works, if you observe, from the time he awakes till he goes to sleep again, you will find that he does nothing but what tends to the attaining of some one or other of these vile, sensible things, namely either riches to heap them up, or pleasure which he may take, or lust which he may satisfy, or revenge whereby he may pacify his mind, or power to defend himself, or some outward work commanded by the law, whereof he may make a vainglorious shew, or whereby he may save his own neck. Now all these things are darkness upon darkness in the depth of the sea. Neither is there any of you that doth not enter in thither, for such is the unchangeable decree of the Lord. And when he understood the condition of mankind, and that the greatest part of them were like brute beasts, he knew that all wisdom, direction, and good success consisted in what the messengers of God had spoken, and the law delivered, and that there was no other way besides this, and that there could be nothing added to it, and that there were men appointed to every work, and that every one was best capable of doing that unto which he was appointed by nature, that this was God's way of dealing with those which were gone before, and that there is no change in his way. Whereupon, returning to Salaman and his friends, he begged their pardon for what he had said to them, and desired to be excused, and told them that he was of the same opinion with them, and went on in the same way, and persuaded them to stick firmly to their resolution of keeping within the bounds of the law and the performance of the external rites, and that they should not much dive into the things that did not concern them, and that in doubtful things they should give credit and yield their assent readily, and that they should abstain from novel opinions and from their appetites, and follow the examples of their pious ancestors, and forsake novelties, and that they should avoid that neglect of religious performances which was seen in the vulgar sort of men, and the love of the world which he principally cautioned them against. For both he and his friend Asal knew that this tractable but defective sort of men had no other way in the world to escape, but only by this means, and that if they should be raised above this to curious speculations, it would be worse with them, and they would not be able to attain to the degree of the blessed, but would fluctuate and be tossed up and down, and make a bad end. But on the contrary, if they continued in that state in which they were till death overtook them, they should be happy, and stand on the right hand. But as for those that outwent them, they should also take place of them, and that they should be the next. So they took their leave and left them, and sought for an opportunity of returning to their island, till it pleased God to help them to a convenience of passing. And Hayy Ibn Yaqzan endeavoured to attain to his lofty station by the same means he had sought it at first, till he recovered it. And Asal followed his steps till he came near him, or wanted but very little of it. And thus they continued serving God in this island till they died. And this is that, God assist thee and us by his Spirit, which we have received of the history of Hayy Ibn Yaqzan, Asal and Salaman, which comprehends such choice of words as are not found in any other book, nor heard in common discourse. And it is a piece of hidden knowledge which none can receive, but those which have the knowledge of God, nor can any be ignorant of it, but those which have not. Now we have taken a contrary method to our pious ancestors, as to their reservedness in this matter, and sparingness of speech. And the reason which did the more easily persuade me to divulge this secret and tear the veil was because of the corrupt notions which some pretenders to philosophy in our age have broached and scattered, so that they are diffused through several countries, and the mischief which arises from thence is become epidemical. Fearing therefore lest those weak ones, who reject the tradition of the prophets, of blessed memory, and make choice of that which is delivered them by fools, should imagine that these opinions are that secret, which ought to be withheld from those who are not worthy or capable of it, and so their desire and study of these opinions should be increased. I have thought good to give them a glimpse of this secret of secrets, that I might draw them into the right way, and avert them from this other. Nevertheless, I have not so delivered the secrets which are comprehended in these few leaves, as to leave them without a thin veil or cover over them, which will be easily rent by those who are worthy of it, but will be so thick to him that is unworthy to pass beyond it, that he shall not be able to get through it. And I desire of those my brethren who shall see this discourse, that they would excuse me for being so easily induced to explain it, and so free in the description of it, seeing I had not done so, if I had not been elevated to such heights as transcend the reach of humane sight, and I was willing to express it in easy terms, that I might dispose men, and raise a desire in them to enter into the right way. And I beg of God pardon and forgiveness, and that he would please to bring us to the true and certain knowledge of himself, for he is gracious and liberal of his favours. Peace be to thee, my brother, whose promotion is decreed, and the mercy find blessing of God be upon thee. Praise be to God alone.